It began with a division built for motion, and forced into stillness at the exact moment motion mattered most. The 10th Armored Division was trained to break through, to surge forward behind roaring engines and coordinated fire, to exploit weakness before an enemy could recover. Its crews learned to think in terms of speed, momentum, and shock. Armor was not meant to sit and absorb punishment. It was meant to move, but war does not always allow units to fight the way they were designed. By the time the division reached Europe, the battlefield was already tightening. Normandy had taught hard lessons about terrain, coordination, and the limits of armored power. Hedgerows swallowed tanks, roads narrowed into traps, air power reshaped movement entirely. The 10th Armored adapted quickly, learning how to fight where space was limited and danger constant. Then winter arrived, and everything changed. When the German offensive exploded through the Ardennes, it did so with speed, surprise, and violence. Roads clogged instantly. Units were scattered. Commanders scrambled to understand where the front even was. In that chaos, the 10th Armored Division was rushed forward, not to exploit a breakthrough, but to stop one. At Bastogne, the division was broken apart deliberately. Combat commands were sent in different directions, each tasked with holding ground against forces that expected quick collapse. Tanks were dug in as fixed gun positions. Crews fought dismounted in snow-filled forests. Infantry clung to villages and road junctions under constant pressure. The division was never meant to fight this way, but it did. The cold was relentless. Engines struggled to start. Fuel was rationed carefully. Ammunition mattered more with every passing hour. German attacks pressed hard, probing for weak points, searching for roads that led through. Every delay mattered. Every stand bought time for something larger to form behind it. At Noville and along surrounding approaches, elements of the 10th Armored absorbed blows meant to open Bastogne completely. Tanks burned. Positions were overrun and retaken. Orders shifted constantly as the situation evolved faster than plans could keep up. What held the line was not perfection. It was refusal. Refusal to collapse. Refusal to give ground easily. Refusal to let speed decide the outcome. The division's actions helped shape the battle far beyond its own positions. The delays inflicted on advancing German forces disrupted timetables that could not afford disruption. Bastogne held. Reinforcements arrived. Momentum began to drain away. After the Ardennes, the 10th Armored rebuilt and moved forward again, returning to the role it had trained for, advancing across rivers, clearing towns, and pushing into Germany as resistance slowly unraveled. But the division was no longer the same. It carried the memory of holding when holding felt impossible. The history of the 10th Armored Division is not a story of uninterrupted advance. It is a story of adaptability, of armor forced to fight like infantry, of momentum sacrificed deliberately so others could regain it later. It shows how modern war reshapes even the most specialized formations, demanding endurance where speed was expected, and patience where aggression once ruled. Tonight, we return to that journey, to the frozen roads leading into Bastogne, to the scattered commands holding ground against pressure, to a division that proved armor does not always win by moving. Sometimes it wins by staying exactly where it is. Before we continue, let me bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time has settled around you there? Is it late into the night, early morning, or that quiet hour when the world finally slows down? And one final invitation, unique to this story alone. If listening to these long, steady histories helps you unwind, reflect, or feel anchored at the end of the day, consider subscribing, not for excitement, but for continuity. So, these thoughtful journeys through the past are always here when you need something calm, immersive, and unhurried. Settle in. This is the history of the 10th Armored Division, and it begins where speed gave way to resolve. July 15th, 1942, Camp Gordon, Georgia. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees by 10 in the morning when the men first saw what they'd be riding into battle. They stood in uneven formation on the dusty parade ground, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students who'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, all staring at the hulking metal shape before them. The M3 Grant medium tank sat baking in the southern sun, its riveted armor already too hot to touch, its 37mm gun looking somehow inadequate even to untrained eyes. This was the 10th Armored Division's first day of existence, and already the questions were forming in the minds of men who didn't yet know enough to be properly afraid. They didn't know that what they were looking at was already obsolete. That American tank design had fallen years behind Germany's, that the vehicles they'd eventually take to war would barely be better than this training relic. They couldn't have known that in 2 years they'd be facing the most feared weapons in Hitler's arsenal, with equipment that, on paper, shouldn't stand a chance. The 10th Armored Division was born that sweltering summer day as part of America's desperate attempt to build a modern armored force from almost nothing. The United States had entered the Second World War with an army that ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's, with tank designs based on theories from the First World War. Now, 7 months after Pearl Harbor, the War Department was activating new divisions as fast as training facilities could be built and equipment could be manufactured. The 10th Armored was among the second wave of armored divisions, benefiting from the painful lessons learned by earlier units, but still facing a learning curve that would be measured in blood. Major General Paul Newgarden, a career cavalry officer who'd spent the 1920s arguing that tanks were the future of warfare, took command with the kind of grim determination that came from knowing exactly how unprepared his nation was for mechanized combat. His division would eventually comprise 10,937 officers and men, 3 tank battalions equipped with 186 M4 Sherman tanks, 3 armored infantry battalions, and all the supporting artillery, engineers, and supply units needed to keep an armored division functioning in combat. But on that first day, all he had was a collection of civilians in new uniforms and a training timeline that kept getting shorter as the news from North Africa grew worse. August brought the first real training, and with it, the first casualties. A demonstration of the new Sherman tank, which had just begun arriving to replace the obsolete Grants, went catastrophically wrong when a hydraulic failure sent the turret spinning uncontrollably. 3 men were injured, but the real damage was psychological. The Sherman's armor, the men learned, was just 76 millimeters thick at its strongest point. Its 75-millimeter gun could penetrate most German tanks, the instructors assured them, at ranges under 1,000 yards. What the instructors didn't emphasize, what most of the trainees didn't yet understand, was that combat ranges in North Africa were often 2,000 yards or more, and that German tank guns were effective well beyond American engagement distances. The Sherman weighed 33 tons and could reach 26 miles per hour on roads, making it faster than most enemy armor. But speed, the men would learn, was small comfort when you were absorbing hits from guns that could punch through your armor before you could get close enough to shoot back. Still, in August of 1942, these concerns seemed abstract, problems for some future version of themselves that would exist in the theoretical realm of actual combat. By December, the news from North Africa had turned from abstract to horrifying. Operation Torch, America's first major offensive, had encountered German armor in Tunisia, and the results were devastating. Reports filtered back to training camps across America, carefully sanitized but impossible to hide completely. American tanks were being destroyed at alarming rates. The German Mark IV, once considered roughly equivalent to the Sherman, had been upgraded with a longer, more powerful gun. And then there were the Tigers, the Panzer Sikhs. Tiger I had appeared in Tunisia like something from a nightmare, a 56-ton monster with an 88-millimeter gun that could kill Shermans at ranges where American guns couldn't even damage its frontal armor. 100 millimeters of face-hardened steel protected the Tiger's front. Its gun could penetrate the Sherman's armor at 2,500 yards. The Sherman had to close within 500 yards to have any chance of a frontal kill, and at 500 yards, every Tiger shot was lethal. The men of the 10th Armored digested these reports during their Christmas break, and when they returned in January of 1943, the training had taken on a new intensity, driven by the understanding that what they were preparing for was no longer theoretical. The spring and summer of 1943 brought advanced training, large-scale maneuvers across the Tennessee hills that were meant to simulate European terrain. General Newgarden pushed his men relentlessly, running exercises that lasted 72 hours without sleep. forcing tank crews and infantry to coordinate in conditions that deliberately replicated the chaos of actual combat. Radio discipline, navigation, mechanical maintenance under stress, every skill was tested until it became instinctive. But beneath the competence his division was developing, Newgarden harbored a private fear that kept him awake at night. The reports from Sicily, where American armor had faced German panzers in July, showed the same pattern as Tunisia. American tanks were faster, more numerous, and better supported by infantry and artillery. They were also being destroyed at a rate of 3-to-1 in tank versus tank combat. The Shermans' weaknesses weren't going away. The Army was working on improved ammunition, on better tactics, on new tank destroyers to supplement the Shermans. But fundamentally, American tankers would go into battle in vehicles that were outgunned and out-armored by Germany's best. The question wasn't whether the 10th Armored's Shermans were good enough. The question was whether the men inside them were. By autumn of 1943, the 10th Armored Division had become one of the most thoroughly trained units in the American Army. They'd spent 15 months in training, more than twice the 6-month cycle that early war divisions had received. Their gunnery scores were exceptional, their maintenance ratings near perfect, their tactical exercises consistently graded as excellent. In November, they expected deployment orders for England, where they would join the massive buildup for the invasion of France. Instead, they received orders to continue training. Then, in December, those orders were countermanded. The division would remain at Camp Gordon indefinitely. Rumors spread through the ranks, the kind of wild speculation that fills any information vacuum. They were being held back for the invasion of Japan. They were going to be converted to infantry. Their equipment was being given to other units. The truth, which wouldn't become clear for months, was that the War Department was in a vicious internal battle over the division's future. The European theater was screaming for replacements, individual soldiers to fill the gaps in divisions that had been ground down by combat. The 10th Armored, with its 10,000 highly trained men, represented a massive pool of potential replacements. Disbanding the division and distributing its personnel to other units would solve an immediate crisis. But it would also waste 15 months of training and eliminate a formation that, on paper, was one of the best prepared armored divisions in the Army. March of 1944 brought a resolution, but not deployment. The division would remain intact, but it would also have to contribute to the replacement pool. 66 officers and 1,200 enlisted men, carefully selected to minimize the impact on unit cohesion, were transferred out. For those who remained, it was a bitter pill. Men they'd trained alongside for nearly 2 years were suddenly gone, dispersed to units they'd never heard of. The division absorbed replacements, new men who hadn't been through the Tennessee maneuvers or the endless gunnery drills, who had to be integrated into companies and platoons that had long since formed their own cultures and hierarchies. General Newgarden fought against every transfer, arguing that breaking up his division piecemeal was the worst of all possible solutions. But the replacement crisis was real, and the War Department's needs were immediate. The 10th Armored would survive as a unit, but it would do so diminished, its deployment delayed yet again. As spring turned to summer, and the invasion of France finally came on June 6th, the men of the 10th Armored watched from Georgia, wondering if they'd missed their war, if all the training and preparation would be for nothing, because the fighting would be over before they ever got their chance. June 10th, 1944, 4 days after D-Day. The call came through to division headquarters at 3 in the morning. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, had personally requested the 10th Armored Division. The request had gone all the way to General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, who had reviewed the division's training records and made his decision. The 10th Armored would deploy to England immediately to join Patton's command. The division that had been on the verge of disbandment 6 months earlier was suddenly the specifically requested unit of America's most aggressive and demanding commander. Newgarden gathered his staff that morning and shared what he knew. Patton had reviewed training scores for every available armored division. He'd spoken with officers who'd observed the 10th Armored during maneuvers. He'd concluded that this division, with its exceptional training scores and unusually long preparation time, was worth waiting for. What Newgarden didn't tell his staff, what he'd learned in a private communication, was that Patton had another reason for his choice. The Third Army commander expected to be fighting through heavily fortified territory in eastern France, terrain where the rapid advances across France would bog down into the kind of grinding, close-quarters combat that favored defenders. He needed a division that could think on its feet, that could adapt standard doctrine to impossible situations, that had been trained so thoroughly that its reactions would be instinctive even when everything went wrong. He needed the kind of unit that could be trusted with missions where failure wasn't an option. September 11th, 1944. Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. The 10th Armored Division boarded ships for England, 15 months after they had originally expected deployment, 26 months after activation. They left behind the red Georgia clay that had become depressingly familiar. The training grounds where they'd spent countless hours perfecting skills they'd begun to fear they'd never use in actual combat. The mood was strange, a mixture of relief, anxiety, and something close to vindication. They were finally going. The equipment they'd trained on for so long was being loaded into transport ships, Shermans with 75mm guns that everyone knew were inadequate, tank destroyers that were faster and more lightly armored than tanks, half-tracks and trucks, and the thousands of tons of supplies that an armored division consumed in combat. As their ships pulled away from the New Jersey coast, the men stood on deck watching America recede. Some wrote letters home that wouldn't be mailed for weeks. Others tried to sleep, knowing that the Atlantic crossing would take 2 weeks, and that whatever awaited them in Europe would require every ounce of rest they could steal beforehand. None of them knew that they were about to enter a war that was becoming more desperate by the day, that the German army they'd been training to fight had learned its own lessons and was preparing defenses that would test every skill they had acquired over 2 years of training. October 2nd, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. 4 months after D-Day, the beach was transformed into a massive logistics hub, but the scars of the invasion remained. Destroyed landing craft still littered the waterline. German bunkers, blasted open by naval gunfire, stood as concrete monuments to the battle that had been fought here. The 10th Armored Division came ashore in good order, their vehicles waterproofed and ready, their men eager after weeks at sea and in English staging areas. But what they saw as they moved inland sobered even the most enthusiastic. The hedgerow country of Normandy, scene of some of the war's most brutal fighting, was a moonscape. Every field showed the marks of artillery. Every village was partially destroyed. Every road was cratered and barely repaired. And everywhere there were signs of armor combat, burned-out Shermans with their turrets blown off, destroyed German tanks left where they'd been killed, impact marks on stone walls showing where high-velocity rounds had missed their targets and kept going. This was what they'd trained for, what all the maneuvers and exercises had been building toward. As the division moved into its assembly areas in Normandy and began the process of final preparation for combat, the men of the 10th Armored began to understand that their 26 months of training hadn't been wasted. They were going to need every single day of it, and they were going to need something more, something that couldn't be taught in training, the ability to face tigers with inadequate equipment and somehow, impossibly, find a way to win anyway. March 16th, 1944. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. In a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor, 6 colonels and 2 generals were having an argument that would determine whether the 10th Armored Division would ever see combat. On the wall hung a map of Europe, covered with unit symbols and colored pins representing American, British, and German forces. On the table sat a manila folder containing training evaluation reports for the 10th Armored, reports that showed a division performing at exceptional levels across every measurable category. And in the minds of everyone in that room was a single overwhelming problem that threatened to undermine the entire American effort in Europe: the replacement crisis. American divisions in Italy and England were chronically short of men, worn down by casualties and the relentless demands of modern warfare. The pipeline of individual replacements from the United States couldn't keep up with losses, and here was the 10th Armored Division, 10,000 trained soldiers sitting in Georgia, fully equipped and ready, but not deployed. To the staff officers looking at spreadsheets and projections, the solution seemed obvious: break up the division, distribute its personnel as individual replacements, and solve several immediate problems. The question being debated wasn't whether they needed those men. The question was whether they needed them more as individuals or as a division. The case for disbandment was brutally pragmatic. 5 divisions in Italy were each short between 800 and 1,500 men, gaps that affected every aspect of their combat effectiveness. 3 more divisions in England, preparing for the cross-channel invasion, had similar shortfalls. The 10th Armored's 10,000 men could fill most of those gaps and still leave enough for a reserve pool. The division had never seen combat, had no battle history or reputation to preserve. Its equipment could be redistributed to other units or held in reserve. From a purely numerical standpoint, breaking up one uncommitted division to solve the immediate problems of 8 combat-experienced divisions made perfect sense. But several officers in that conference room had spent time observing the 10th Armored during training, and they made a different argument. The division's training scores weren't just good, they were the highest in the Army. Gunnery scores 92% versus a 78% average. Tactical problem scores that consistently graded as excellent. Maintenance and supply ratings that suggested a level of organizational competence rare in any military unit. Disbanding this division wouldn't just be sacrificing numbers, it would be sacrificing quality at a time when quality might matter more than quantity. The debate raged through March and into April. The division itself knew nothing of this discussion, continuing its training schedule while the Pentagon argued over its future. On April 7th, General Newgarden received tentative deployment orders. Prepare to ship to England by May 1st. On April 12th, those orders were canceled. On April 21st, they were reinstated. On April 28th, they were canceled again. Each cycle of orders and cancellations damaged morale and disrupted preparation. Units that had been packing equipment had to unpack it. Soldiers who'd been given pre-deployment leave had to be recalled, then given leave again when orders changed. The division was trapped in limbo, caught between the need for its existence and the immediate demands of the replacement system. Staff officers began referring to it as the division that almost wasn't, and the phrase captured something essential about its status. It existed, it was trained and equipped, but its future hung in balance based on decisions being made in conference rooms where organizational charts mattered more than the 2 years of preparation the unit had undergone. May 15, 1944. The decision reached General George Marshall's desk in the form of a 2-page memorandum that laid out the arguments for and against disbanding the 10th Armored Division. Marshall, who as Chief of Staff had the final word on such matters, spent less than an hour reviewing the file before making his decision. The division would remain intact and would deploy to join 3rd Army under George Patton. Marshall's reasoning, recorded in his notes from that day, reflected both strategic calculation and intuition born from decades of military service. The replacement crisis was real, but it was also temporary. More men were in the training pipeline, and while the immediate shortfall was painful, it could be managed. What couldn't be easily replaced was a fully trained, cohesive division with exceptional performance indicators. Marshall had seen enough of this war to know that victory in Europe would require not just numbers, but the ability to adapt to unexpected challenges. The German army, for all its losses, remained a formidable fighting force led by experienced officers and filled with veterans of years of combat. Defeating it would require American units that could match that experience, not just with time in combat, but with thorough training and tactical sophistication. The 10th Armored represented exactly that kind of unit. Marshall's decision came with a caveat that would shape the division's immediate future. The division would deploy, but it would also have to contribute to the replacement pool. 66 officers and 1,200 enlisted men would be transferred out before deployment. The transfers would be carefully managed to minimize impact on unit cohesion, taking men from across the division rather than gutting specific units. It was a compromise, one that satisfied neither side of the internal Pentagon debate. The 10th Armored would survive as a division, but would do so diminished, required to sacrifice a tenth of its strength to solve a problem it hadn't created. For General Newgarden, receiving the news on May 16th, the decision was bittersweet. His division would go to war, but it would do so having lost 1,266 men who'd trained alongside their comrades for nearly 2 years. The impact on morale was immediate and painful. Men who'd expected to go into combat together found themselves suddenly reassigned, shipped to replacement depots to be distributed to units they'd never heard of. The division that remained had to absorb new replacements, men who hadn't been through the Tennessee maneuvers or the endless training cycles that had forged the unit's identity. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The invasion of France that the 10th Armored had been training for finally came, and they watched it from Camp Gordon. Radio reports described the landings, the fighting in the hedgerows, the desperate German resistance. The men of the 10th Armored listened with a mixture of relief that they weren't in that initial assault and frustration that they were missing the war's defining moment. As June turned to July and the fighting in Normandy bogged down into brutal attrition, the division continued its training, incorporating lessons from the bocage fighting into their exercises. They learned about the improvised hedgerow cutters that Sherman crews were welding to their tanks, about the German tactics of defense in depth that were making every field a potential killing ground, about the way that close terrain negated American advantages in artillery and air support. Each lesson reinforced what Newgarden had been preaching for months. This war would be won not by the side with the best equipment, but by the side that adapted fastest to changed circumstances. The 10th Armored's long training period, once a source of frustration, was becoming an advantage. They had time to learn from others' mistakes before making their own. July brought clarity to the division's future. General Patton, whose Third Army was scheduled to activate in France once the breakout from Normandy began, submitted a list of units he wanted under his command. The 10th Armored Division was on that list, specifically requested based on Patton's review of training records. Patton was known for his attention to detail when it came to the units he commanded, for his belief that superior training and aggressive leadership could overcome material disadvantages. He'd reviewed evaluations for every available armored division and had specifically asked for the 10th Armored, despite its lack of combat experience. The news reached Camp Gordon through unofficial channels before the formal orders arrived, and it transformed the division's mood. They weren't just deploying, they were being specifically requested by the Army's most successful combat commander. Whatever frustrations they had felt about the delays, whatever resentment lingered from the replacement transfers, was overwhelmed by the validation that Patton's selection represented. They were going to war under a commander who'd chosen them deliberately, who'd looked at what they could do and decided they were worth waiting for. August and early September were consumed by final preparations. Equipment was inspected and re-inspected. Training focused on the specific challenges of the European theater: French villages with thick stone walls, German defensive tactics, coordination with tactical air support. The division conducted one final large-scale exercise, a 72-hour maneuver that simulated a breakthrough operation against prepared defenses. The exercise was graded by observers from Third Army, and their report went directly to Patton. The 10th Armored Division demonstrates exceptional tactical flexibility and superior coordination between armor and infantry elements. Recommend immediate deployment. On September 1st, formal deployment orders arrived. The division would move to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, for overseas processing, then shipped to England before moving to France. The timeline was aggressive. They'd be in combat by late October. For men who'd trained for 26 months, who'd endured delays and frustrations and watched other divisions go to war ahead of them, the news brought a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was what they'd prepared for, what all the training had been building toward. But preparation and execution were different things, and the gap between them was where men discovered whether their training was sufficient. September 11th, 1944. The division boarded trains for New Jersey, leaving Georgia behind. Camp Gordon, with its red clay and summer heat, had been home for over 2 years. Men had arrived there as civilians and were leaving as soldiers, transformed by the relentless training cycle into something different from what they'd been. The train journey north took 3 days, and the men used the time to write letters, to sleep, to contemplate what was coming. They didn't know that they were about to enter a war that was changing, that the rapid advances across France would soon give way to a different kind of fighting as American armies reached Germany's borders. They didn't know that within 2 months, they'd be committed to a battle that would test every skill they had learned. They didn't know that their division, the unit that had almost been disbanded to solve a bureaucratic problem, would soon play a decisive role in the war's most critical battle. What they knew was that they were finally going. that the preparation was ending and the execution was about to begin, and that whatever came next would determine whether those 26 months of training had been sufficient, or if they'd needed even more time that the war hadn't been willing to give them. The deployment to Europe would take the 10th Armored Division from the familiar world of training camps and exercises into the reality of industrial warfare at its most brutal. They would discover that no amount of training could fully prepare men for the chaos of actual combat, for the noise and fear and confusion that turned carefully rehearsed plans into improvisation. But they would also discover that thorough preparation mattered, that the skills drilled into them over 2 years could become instinctive even under stress, that the doctrine they had learned could be adapted when circumstances required it. The division that almost wasn't would soon become the division that Patton couldn't do without, the unit that he called on when other formations had been ground down to ineffectiveness. But in September of 1944, as they shipped across the Atlantic toward England and then France, that future was unknown. All they had was their training, their equipment, and the knowledge that somewhere ahead of them, German armies waited to test whether American armor and American soldiers could match the Wehrmacht's years of experience. The answer to that question would be written in the towns and forests of eastern France, in battles that would transform a well-trained but untested division into veterans who would earn their reputation the hardest way possible. October 2nd, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The tide was out, exposing the famous obstacles that had claimed so many landing craft 4 months earlier. The 10th Armored Division came ashore in a Normandy transformed from battlefield to logistics hub. But the scars of June 6th were everywhere. Burned-out German bunkers stared down at the beach from the bluffs, their concrete walls blasted open by naval gunfire. Destroyed vehicles, American and German, had been bulldozed into piles awaiting salvage. Impact craters pocked the landscape, filled with brackish water that reflected the gray October sky. The men of the 10th Armored filed down the ramps of their landing ships in good order, their equipment waterproofed, their vehicles properly prepared. But what they saw as they assembled on the beach drove home the reality of what they were entering. This was where thousands of men had died fighting their way 100 yards inland. This was where American soldiers had faced the ultimate test and, at terrible cost, prevailed. As the division moved off the beach and into the Norman countryside, every mile reinforced the lesson. This was a land at war. The drive through Normandy to their assembly areas near Metz took 3 days, and those 3 days were an education in what mechanized warfare looked like in its aftermath. The hedgerow country, scene of some of the summer's most brutal fighting, was a landscape of destruction. Every village showed damage, from light scarring to complete devastation. Stone walls were pockmarked with bullet impacts. Some houses were roofless shells. Entire orchards had been reduced to splintered stumps by artillery fire. The roads were decent, repaired by army engineers, but flanking the roads were the wrecks of war. Burned-out Sherman tanks sat in fields, their turrets blown off or their hulls gutted by fire. German panzers and self-propelled guns, similarly destroyed, marked where German counterattacks had been stopped. The men of the 10th Armored studied these wrecks with the intensity of students before an exam, looking for patterns, for lessons, for anything that might help them survive what was coming. What they saw wasn't encouraging. The Shermans had died in groups, suggesting that German guns had been killing them faster than crews could react. The German vehicles showed different damage patterns, many knocked out from above by airstrikes or destroyed by concentrated artillery fire rather than tank guns. October the 23rd, 1944. 3rd Army Headquarters, Forward Command Post. General Patton stood before a map of eastern France, one hand resting on the city of Metz. Around him, staff officers and division commanders listened as he outlined 3rd Army's next objective. The rapid advance across France had stalled at the German border, where the Wehrmacht had established defensive lines along rivers and ridges, taking advantage of territory they'd spent 4 years fortifying. Metz, a city on the Moselle River, anchored the German line. It had to be taken, Patton explained, but he was under no illusions about what that would require. Metz was one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe, surrounded by a ring of 43 interconnected forts designed by German military engineers in the 1870s and modernized in the 1900s. The city had never fallen to direct assault in 1,500 years of military history. Napoleon had bypassed it. The Prussians had besieged it for 2 months in 1870, and now, in October of 1944, with winter approaching and supply lines stretched to their limits, Patton was tasking his Third Army with taking what everyone agreed couldn't be taken. The 10th Armored Division, newly arrived and untested, was being assigned a key role in this impossible operation. The mission brief was sobering. The 10th Armored would attack from the south, reducing German strongpoints and penetrating the fortress ring to reach the city center. They'd be supported by infantry divisions, by artillery, by tactical air power when weather permitted. But the core of the operation would be armor, tanks, and tank destroyers fighting through prepared defenses designed specifically to stop armored assaults. General Newgarden, receiving his orders, asked the obvious question: what was the expected timeline? Patton's answer was brutally honest. As long as it takes. Metz has to fall before we can advance into Germany, so you'll stay there until the job is done, even if it takes all winter. The message was clear. This wasn't a raid or a quick strike. This was siege warfare, the kind of grinding attritional combat that American doctrine said armor should avoid. But doctrine had to bend to reality. And the reality was that Metz blocked Third Army's advance. Someone had to reduce it, and Patton had decided that someone was the 10th Armored. As Newgarden left the briefing to return to his division, he carried with him the knowledge that his unit's baptism of fire would be in the worst possible conditions against the most difficult terrain imaginable. November 9th, 1944, 5 miles south of Metz, near the approaches to Fort Driant. The 21st Tank Battalion, 1st Lieutenant James Carter, commanding Company B, approached their first combat action at dawn. Carter sat in his Sherman's turret, scanning the terrain ahead through binoculars. The landscape was deceptive: rolling farmland, bare trees, scattered stone buildings that looked peaceful in the morning light. But intelligence reports said Fort Driant's outworks were ahead, positions dug into the hillsides and connected by tunnels, defended by elements of the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division with anti-tank guns and mortars. Carter had studied the maps until he could draw them from memory. He'd reviewed the after-action reports from previous assaults on these positions. He knew, intellectually, what to expect. But intellectual knowledge and experience were different things, and in the next 12 minutes, he'd learn that difference the hardest way possible. At 06:15, his lead platoon crossed the line of departure. At 06:18, German anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions 800 yards ahead. The first shot hit Carter's lead tank on the frontal armor, a clean penetration that killed the driver instantly and set off ammunition in the fighting compartment. The tank exploded, turret lifting off the hull ring and tumbling aside. The next 2 shots followed within seconds, destroying 2 more Shermans before their crews could even identify where the fire was coming from. The company scattered, seeking cover in the undulating terrain, returning fire at muzzle flashes. Carter's gunner spotted an anti-tank gun position and fired the 75mm high explosive round, impacting near the target but not silencing it. German mortars began falling, walking across the battlefield toward the American armor. Carter radioed for artillery supports, gave coordinates, tried to organize his scattered company into some kind of coherent formation. This was nothing like training. In training, the enemy followed predictable patterns. In training, there were safety officers and rules and the knowledge that no one would actually die. Here, every second brought new threats, new chaos, new proof that all the preparation in the world couldn't fully capture the reality of combat. The company eventually withdrew, carrying their wounded, leaving 3 Shermans burning on the approaches to Fort Driant. First contact with the enemy, 12 minutes of combat, 3 tanks destroyed, 8 men killed, 5 wounded. The lesson was brutal and immediate. The Germans were good at this, experienced and well-positioned, fighting from fortifications that American doctrine said armor couldn't assault. And yet, assault them is exactly what the 10th Armored Division had been ordered to do. November 10th through November 22nd. 13 days of combat that ground the division down and transformed it from a training unit into veterans. The fighting around Metz developed a pattern, American forces would advance until they encountered prepared German positions, then would have to reduce those positions through a combination of artillery, infantry assault, and armored support. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day, sometimes less. The 10th Armored's tank battalions learned to work closely with infantry. Sherman crews developing an instinctive coordination with rifle squads that allowed them to clear villages and strong points systematically. They learned which stone buildings could support anti-tank guns and needed to be destroyed before advancing. They learned to recognize the signature dirt spray of German mortars and to scatter before the rounds impacted. They learned the distinctive crack of German 88mm guns, different from the lower velocity 75mm guns on Mark IV tanks, and to react differently to each threat. Most importantly, they learned that the tactical doctrine they'd spent 2 years perfecting in training had to be adapted, sometimes abandoned, to survive against an enemy that had been fighting this war for 5 years. The urban warfare in Metz itself was unlike anything the division had experienced. American doctrine said armor avoided cities, but Metz couldn't be bypassed. Combat command. Fought house to house, block by block. Their Shermans advancing with infantry support through streets barely wide enough for the tanks to pass. German defenders had prepared the city for exactly this kind of fighting, positioning anti-tank guns in cellars with narrow firing ports, mining streets, creating interconnected defensive positions that allowed them to fall back and reinforce threatened sectors. The Americans learned to use their advantages: artillery support to blast buildings before infantry cleared them, tank guns firing directly into suspected strongpoints, engineers using demolition charges to create new routes when streets were blocked. Lieutenant Carter, who'd survived that first contact on November 9th, described the fighting in a letter home. In training, they told us tanks should stay out of cities. But we're in the cities anyway, doing things the instructors said were impossible, and somehow we're making it work. We've lost tanks, lost men, but we're learning faster than the Germans can adapt. That learning curve, paid for in blood, was transforming the 10th Armored from a well-trained division into something more, a combat-tested unit that could adapt doctrine to reality. November the 22, 1944, Metz city center. Fort John d'Arc, the last major German strongpoint within the city, surrendered at 1400 hours. The garrison, surrounded and out of ammunition, had fought for 11 days past the point where continued resistance made tactical sense. When the German commander finally emerged under a white flag, he was leading 800 men, all that remained of a force that had numbered 3,000 when the siege began. The American officer accepting the surrender was a major from the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command headquarters, and he conducted the ceremony with the kind of exhausted professionalism that came from 2 weeks of nearly continuous combat. Metz had fallen, the fortress city that had never been taken by direct assault. The cost had been significant. The 10th Armored had lost 27 tanks destroyed, 184 casualties, including 38 killed. But they'd captured 6,000 German defenders, had advanced 7 miles in 14 days through prepared defenses, and had accomplished a mission that military history said was impossible. More importantly, they'd learned lessons that no training could teach, had discovered that their preparation was sufficient to allow them to survive, adapt, and ultimately prevail against experienced opponents fighting from excellent positions. The fall of Metz marked the end of the 10th Armored Division's baptism by fire. They'd entered combat as a unit with exceptional training, but no experience, and they'd emerged as veterans who'd faced the hardest kind of fighting and succeeded. The lessons learned in those 2 weeks would shape everything that came after. They'd discovered that American armor could fight in cities, despite doctrine saying otherwise. They'd learned that coordination between tanks and infantry could overcome prepared defenses. They'd proven that thorough training could partially substitute for combat experience, allowing them to adapt faster than units that had learned everything on the battlefield. But they'd also paid the price for those lessons in destroyed equipment and dead comrades, and they'd learned the fundamental truth of armored warfare in World War II. American tanks were inferior to German tanks in direct combat, but American combined arms tactics and operational flexibility could offset that material disadvantage. As the division prepared for their next operation, those lessons would prove critical. because what they'd faced at Metz, difficult as it had been, was just the beginning. Ahead of them lay battles where they'd face not just fortifications and infantry, but Germany's elite armored formations, battles where all their training and newly won experience would be tested against the Wehrmacht's best. November 12, 1944. Field Headquarters, 10th Armored Division, 3 kilometers south of Metz. The after-action review began at 2100 hours, long after dark, in a command tent lit by Coleman lanterns that cast harsh shadows on the tired faces of company and battalion commanders. Outside, the sounds of the siege continued: distant artillery, occasional small arms fire, the rumble of vehicles moving supplies forward. Inside, General Newgarden and his staff were conducting what would become one of the war's most important tactical discussions. On a makeshift table lay maps marked with unit positions, casualty reports, and, most tellingly, a sheaf of papers documenting every tank loss the division had suffered in the 3 days of combat. 22 Shermans destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. The numbers told a story that made everyone in that tent uncomfortable. American doctrine, the tactical playbook they'd trained on for 2 years, wasn't working. Not completely failing, not getting everyone killed, but not working well enough. The Germans were destroying American tanks at a rate that was sustainable only because American industrial production could replace losses faster than German guns could inflict them. That was a strategy, but it wasn't a good one, and everyone in that tent knew it. The standard American armor doctrine in late 1944 called for tanks to advance in extended line formation with infantry support. The theory was sound: present multiple targets to force the enemy to divide their fire, maintain momentum through aggressive forward movement, use superior numbers to overwhelm defensive positions. It worked well against disorganized opposition, or when facing enemy infantry without significant anti-tank support. But against German combined arms defenses, with anti-tank guns positioned in depth and infantry with Panzerfaust rockets, the doctrine was getting men killed unnecessarily. Captain James Leach, commanding Company B of the 21st Tank Battalion, stood at the map and explained what he'd learned that afternoon. His company had approached a German position using standard doctrine: 5 Shermans in line abreast, infantry following in half tracks. German guns hidden on the flanks had knocked out 2 tanks before his formation could react. The problem, Leach explained, is that we're predictable. The Germans know exactly how we'll attack because we attack the same way every time. They position their guns to cover our standard approach routes, and we drive right into their fire. The observation sparked an hour of discussion that would reshape how the 10th Armored Division fought for the rest of the war. What emerged from that November 12th meeting was heretical by the standards of American armored doctrine. The division would start incorporating German defensive and offensive tactics into their own operations. Someone, possibly Captain Leach though, accounts differ, suggested using reverse slope positioning, a German tactic where tanks held positions just behind hilltops rather than on the crests. American doctrine put tanks on the crests for better observation and fields of fire, but that made them silhouettes against the skyline, easy targets for enemy gunners. German panzers, fighting defensively for most of the war by this point, had learned to use reverse slopes, popping up to fire and then backing down behind cover. Why couldn't Shermans do the same? Another officer suggested abandoning the line formation in favor of wedge attacks, with a lead element drawing fire while flankers maneuvered to hit exposed enemy positions. This was essentially a German assault tactic, and it violated American doctrine that emphasized keeping units online and advancing together. But combat was teaching them that German tactics had evolved through years of fighting, that the Wehrmacht had learned lessons American forces were still discovering. If German methods worked, why not adapt them? November 15, 1944. Captain Leach's company had the mission to clear a village held by German infantry with anti-tank gun support. Instead of the standard approach, he split his force. 3 Shermans advanced directly toward the village, moving fast and presenting obvious targets. 2 more tanks and an attached M10 tank destroyer positioned themselves on a flank, using a tree line for cover, waiting. The German anti-tank gun, positioned to cover the main approach, opened fire on the advancing Shermans at 900 yards, missing the first shot but hitting 1 Sherman on the frontal armor without penetrating. The American tanks returned fire, deliberately aiming high, creating the impression of an earnest but poorly executed attack. The German gun crew, confident in their position, continued engaging the obvious threat. Then the flanking force opened fire from 700 yards at 90 degrees to the German position. The first 75mm round killed the anti-tank gun and its crew. The next round suppressed German infantry positions. The village fell 30 minutes later, with no additional American tank losses. Leach reported the action in detail, noting that the tactic had worked exactly as predicted: present an obvious threat to fix the enemy's attention, then hit them from an unexpected angle. It was basic military theory, but executing it with armor required abandoning the standard doctrine of keeping units together and advancing in formation. The division staff began collecting and systematizing these tactical innovations. By November 19th, they had identified several modifications to standard doctrine that seemed to improve effectiveness. Position tanks using German-style reverse slopes when defending. Use wedge and hammer formations when attacking, with lead elements deliberately drawing fire. Employ indirect fire from Shermans at ranges beyond 2,000 yards, using the 75mm gun, like artillery, to suppress enemy positions before closing. Form tank hunting teams, combining 3 Shermans with 1 M10 tank destroyer and an engineer squad, giving the team both mobility and the heavier firepower needed to deal with German armor. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they represented a willingness to adapt standard doctrine based on combat experience, to learn from enemy tactics rather than rigidly following doctrine that had been developed before anyone understood what fighting in Europe would actually entail. The question was whether higher command would approve these modifications or would insist on adherence to standard procedures. November 24th, 1944. The day after Metz fell, General Neugarten's staff produced a document that would circulate through Third Army and eventually reach tactical schools in the United States. Titled Tactical Modifications for Armored Operations Against Prepared Defenses, it was typed on a field typewriter, carbon copied, and distributed to other divisions before anyone in higher command could review or approve it. The document laid out what the 10th Armored had learned in 2 weeks of combat: specific techniques for urban warfare, guidelines for working with infantry in close terrain, recommendations for combining American firepower advantages with German-derived tactical methods. It was, in effect, a new doctrine written at division level based on immediate combat experience. Patton, when he eventually saw the document, made a note in his diary: "The 10th Armored has written their own tactics manual. It's better than what we taught them. This is what good units do. They adapt." The endorsement from 3rd Army headquarters validated the division's approach and encouraged other units to experiment similarly. The impact of these tactical innovations showed up in the division's combat statistics. In the first 3 days of fighting around Metz using standard doctrine, the 10th Armored's tank battalions had achieved a kill ratio of 0.7 to 1, 7 German armored vehicles destroyed for every 10 American tanks lost. By the final week of the Metz operation, using the modified tactics, that ratio had improved to 2.3 to 1, 23 German vehicles destroyed for every 10 American losses. The difference wasn't in equipment, which remained the same inadequate Shermans they had started with. The difference was in how they employed that equipment, in tactical sophistication born from adapting enemy methods to American operational concepts. Individual tank commanders learned to think like German panzer leaders, using terrain and maneuver to offset the Sherman's material disadvantages. Company commanders learned to coordinate supporting arms in ways that hadn't been emphasized in training. Battalion operations officers learned to plan attacks that anticipated German defensive patterns, rather than hoping American firepower would overwhelm them. This learning process wasn't unique to the 10th Armored Division. Other American units were going through similar evolution, discovering that European combat required modifications to doctrine developed in different contexts. But the 10th Armored's combination of exceptional training and immediate battlefield adaptation created a feedback loop that accelerated their learning. They had the tactical foundation to understand why standard doctrine wasn't working. They had the combat experience to identify what would work better. And they had leadership willing to formally document and distribute innovations rather than keeping them as informal company-level practices. The result was a division that was learning faster than the Germans could adapt to their changes. By late November, German intelligence reports were noting that the American Armored Unit 10 was employing non-standard tactics that complicated defensive planning. Wehrmacht units facing the 10th Armored couldn't rely on the predictable American approaches that had made defensive planning relatively straightforward earlier in the campaign. The tactical manual typed in a tent near Metz in late November 1944 represented something important beyond its immediate military utility. It showed that American forces could adapt, could learn from enemies who'd been fighting longer, could modify doctrine when combat proved it inadequate. The German army had spent the first years of the war demonstrating superior tactical flexibility, and that flexibility had allowed them to defeat opponents with better equipment or stronger positions. Now, in the war's final year, American units like the 10th Armored were learning that same flexibility, developing the institutional ability to modify approaches based on what worked rather than what doctrine said should work. This wasn't about abandoning American methods entirely. The innovations the 10th Armored developed still relied on American advantages: superior artillery support, abundant ammunition, good logistics, eventual air supremacy. But they combined those advantages with tactical techniques learned from studying enemy methods and adapting them to American organizational structures and equipment. The lessons learned fighting for Metz would prove critical in battles to come. Within a month, the 10th Armored would face situations where standard doctrine would have led to disaster, where their ability to adapt quickly to unexpected challenges would mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The German army they'd fought at Metz, though experienced and well-positioned, had been a static defense. Soon they'd face German mobile operations, elite armored units conducting offensive operations with all the skill and aggression that had made the Wehrmacht so dangerous early in the war. When that happened, when the 10th Armored found itself fighting not just against prepared defenses, but against some of Germany's best panzer divisions and desperate counterattacks, the tactical sophistication they had developed in November would be tested to its limits. The division that had spent 2 years training for combat, that had adapted doctrine during its first 2 weeks of action, was about to discover whether all that preparation was sufficient for what the Wehrmacht was planning to throw at them. The answer, when it came, would be written in frozen forests and besieged towns, in battles where tactical excellence was the minimum requirement for survival. November 26th, 1944. Ziegenberg, Germany. Oberbefehlshaber, West Headquarters, buried in concrete bunkers 50 kilometers behind the front lines. The morning intelligence briefing began with a map of the Western Front, colored lines showing Allied and German positions from the North Sea to Switzerland. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, serving as intelligence officer for 5th Panzer Army, stood before assembled staff officers and delivered an assessment that would have immediate consequences for the 10th Armored Division. Though the Americans had no way of knowing it, von der Heide's report identified 3 American divisions as particular concerns for the planned Ardennes offensive. The 4th Armored Division, known for aggressive leadership and rapid operations. The 3rd Armored Division, veteran unit with extensive combat experience, and a newcomer to the combat roster that was showing unexpected competence. The American 10th Armored Division, von der Heide read from his intelligence summary, demonstrates tactical flexibility and training level equivalent to German panzer divisions of 1942. Unit adapted rapidly to fortress warfare at Metz and inflicted higher than expected casualties on defending forces. Recommend classification as enhanced threat. The room fell quiet. Getting Wehrmacht intelligence to classify an American unit as worthy of special attention required exceptional performance, and von der Heide's report provided detailed evidence. The German intelligence assessment of the 10th Armored Division was based on multiple sources. Radio intercepts had captured American communications, revealing unit designations and allowing German analysts to track which units were fighting where. Captured American prisoners had been interrogated, providing information about training, equipment, and morale. Most tellingly, German units that had fought against the 10th Armored had filed after-action reports noting unusual American tactical approaches. The The 462nd Volksgrenadier Division, which had defended the Metz sector, reported that American armor had employed flanking tactics and reverse slope positioning more consistent with German doctrine than standard American approaches. German anti-tank gun crews reported that American tanks had not followed predictable attack patterns, making defensive planning difficult. And the casualty exchange ratios, carefully tracked by German staff officers who knew that the Wehrmacht couldn't afford to trade losses evenly with the Americans, showed that the 10th Armored was inflicting 3 casualties for every one they suffered, well above the average American performance. This combination of tactical sophistication and aggressive execution caught German attention at the highest levels of command. November 30th, 1944. Radio intercept station, German intelligence, monitoring American radio traffic in the Metz sector. The German Signals Intelligence Unit picked up a transmission that would later be found in captured documents and remembered by German survivors. An American tank commander, speaking in clear during an engagement, used the phrase, "Tiger hunting teams, moving to contact." The Germans listening didn't know what tiger hunting teams meant specifically, but the implication was clear. The Americans were forming specialized units to hunt German heavy tanks, and they were confident enough to discuss it on open radio nets. The intercept made its way up the intelligence chain and was included in 5th Panzer Army's assessment of American capabilities. More significantly, the phrase itself began showing up in German intelligence reports with an almost mythical quality. Amerikanische Tigerjäger, American tiger hunters. It suggested that American forces, specifically this 10th Armored Division, had moved beyond simply defending against German armor to actively seeking it out for destruction. For an army whose Tiger tanks had been instruments of psychological warfare as much as tactical weapons, this shift in American attitude was concerning. December 3rd, 1944. 5th Panzer Army planning cells preparing for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The operations maps showed proposed attack routes, objectives, timelines. One map in particular showed the initial assault phase, with red arrows indicating German advances and blue symbols showing expected American positions. Someone had marked the 10th Armored Division's location near the Saar River with a special notation. Priority neutralization target. The German plan for the Ardennes offensive required rapid advances to capture critical road junctions before American forces could organize effective defense. Any American unit that could respond quickly and effectively posed a threat to the entire operations timeline. The 10th Armored, based on their Metz performance, was identified as exactly that kind of unit. The German planners assumed correctly that the 10th Armored would be repositioned to respond to any major German attack. What they couldn't know was exactly where the division would be, or how quickly it could move, but they knew enough to mark it as a unit that needed to be isolated, bypassed, or, if necessary, destroyed before it could interfere with the offensive's critical first days. December 8th, 1944. German reconnaissance patrols, operating in the Luxembourg sector between Metz and the German border, began systematically probing American positions. These weren't the normal patrol activities of a static front. These were deliberate intelligence-gathering operations, trying to identify exactly which American units held which sectors and in what strength. Several of these patrols made contact with elements of the 10th Armored Division, and German intelligence officers carefully noted the locations. The division's positions were plotted on maps in 5th Panzer Army headquarters, information that would inform final planning for the offensive now just 8 days away. German patrol reports noted that American tank patrols were aggressive, that American positions appeared to be reinforced beyond normal frontline density, that the Americans seemed alert and well prepared. This last observation was somewhat puzzling to German planners. The Luxembourg sector was supposed to be a quiet front, a place where tired divisions rested and new divisions acclimated to combat. Why were the Americans maintaining such high readiness levels in a sector where nothing significant was supposed to happen? December 12th, 1944. A German intelligence report crossed the desk of General Hasse von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, and he spent several minutes studying it carefully. The report was a comprehensive assessment of American forces in and around the planned attack sector, and one section dealt specifically with the 10th Armored Division. Unit designation 10 Armored demonstrates training levels significantly above American average. Tactical flexibility suggests thorough preparation and competent leadership. Based on Met's performance, unit can be expected to respond rapidly to threats and adapt quickly to changed circumstances. Radio discipline good. Casualties inflicted versus casualties suffered ratio approximately 3-to-1, higher than typical American armored formations. Assessment: enhanced threat. Recommend specific planning to neutralize or contain this unit during offensive operations. Von Manteuffel made a notation in the margin. How do we keep them away from Bastogne? The question was prescient. His offensive plan required capturing the road junction at Bastogne by the second day of the attack. If the 10th Armored could reach Bastogne first and establish effective defenses, it could delay his advance by days, potentially derailing the entire offensive's timeline. The German planners had identified the threat, but hadn't fully solved the problem of how to prevent it. The German intelligence assessment of the 10th Armored Division was accurate in most respects, but failed to account for one critical factor: the division's physical dispersion. German analysts knew where the division headquarters was located, knew roughly where some combat elements were positioned, but didn't realize how scattered the division had become. American commanders had stretched the 10th Armored across a sector far wider than normal, using them to hold ground that should have required 2 or even 3 divisions. This dispersion meant that the division couldn't concentrate quickly, that responding to a major German attack would require moving separated combat commands across significant distances before they could be committed as a cohesive force. If German planners had understood this weakness, they might have adjusted their planning, but they didn't. And that intelligence gap would have profound consequences for both sides in the battle to come. The Germans saw a dangerous American division and planned accordingly. They didn't see that the dangerous division was also a vulnerable one, spread thin and positioned in a way that made rapid, coordinated response difficult. December 15th, 1944, evening. Final intelligence briefings before the Ardennes offensive. German commanders received updated assessments of American positions, strength estimates, predicted response patterns. The 10th Armored Division appeared in these briefings as a known factor, a unit that would likely be committed to battle, but probably not in time to affect the offensive's critical first phase. German planners estimated that even if the Americans reacted immediately to the attack, it would take the 10th Armored at least 24 hours to redeploy to threatened sectors. By that time, 5th Panzer Army expected to have achieved breakthrough and be racing west toward the Meuse River, past the point where a single American division, no matter how capable, could stop them. This estimate would prove spectacularly wrong, not because German intelligence had misjudged the division's capabilities, but because they'd underestimated how quickly American commanders would commit forces to battle and how much combat power the 10th Armored could generate even when scattered. The Germans had taken notice of the American division, had marked it as a threat, had even tried to plan for it. What they hadn't done was fear it enough. That mistake would cost them in ways that would become apparent very soon. The German recognition of the 10th Armored Division as an elite American unit created a strange dynamic. The division had fought for barely a month, had participated in one major operation, yet had impressed an enemy that generally regarded American forces as materially superior, but tactically unsophisticated. Wehrmacht intelligence officers, many of them veterans of years of combat, had assessed the 10th Armored using the same criteria they'd used for German units, and found them worthy of respect. This wasn't the patronizing acknowledgement that the Americans had good equipment and plenty of it. This was professional recognition that the unit demonstrated tactical competence, that its leaders made sound decisions, that its soldiers executed complex operations effectively. For the men of the 10th Armored, still processing their first combat experiences and mourning their first losses, the idea that they'd caught German attention would have seemed strange. They didn't feel elite. They felt like survivors who'd learned enough to keep surviving. But elite status wasn't about self-perception. It was about how your enemy assessed your capabilities and adapted their planning to account for you. By that measure, the 10th Armored had achieved in 1 month what many units never achieved. They'd become a problem that German planners had to specifically account for when designing operations. December 16, 1944, 05:30. The German artillery barrage that opened the Ardennes offensive crashed across an 80-mile front, the largest artillery preparation since the First World War, in 5th Panzer Army's sector. One of the objectives of that barrage was to isolate and disrupt the 10th Armored Division's positions, to prevent rapid American response to the offensive now beginning. German gunners fired with precision at map coordinates that intelligence had identified as American command posts, supply areas, communication centers. Some of those shells fell on 10th Armored positions. Most didn't, because German intelligence hadn't fully identified where all the division's scattered elements were located. But the intent was clear. The Germans had noticed the 10th Armored Division, had assessed it as a threat, and were now trying to neutralize it before it could interfere with their offensive. Whether they would succeed, whether the month of combat experience and tactical innovation the division had developed would be sufficient against the Wehrmacht's last great gamble, would be determined in the hours and days ahead. The enemy had taken notice. Now, both sides would discover what that notice really meant. December 1st, 1944. The Saar River sector, eastern France. Winter had arrived in force, bringing temperatures that hovered just above freezing during the day and plunged into the teens at night. The 10th Armored Division's Combat Command A was grinding forward through German defensive positions, advancing toward the Saar River against resistance that was determined but not overwhelming. The fighting had settled into a pattern. American forces would identify German strong points, call in artillery to soften them, then send combined tank infantry teams to clear the positions. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day, but it was progress nonetheless. The men were tired, having been in near continuous combat since early November, but the rhythm of offensive operations provided structure to their days. Attack at dawn, consolidate gains by afternoon, prepare defensive positions by evening, endure German artillery harassment through the night. Repeat. It was exhausting and dangerous, but it was also familiar. They had learned how to do this, how to survive it, how to maintain effectiveness even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm training. What none of them knew was that their familiar routine was about to be shattered by events already in motion 50 miles to the north. December 7th, 1944. The last tanks of Combat Command. A crossed the Saar River, establishing a small bridgehead on the eastern bank. It was a tactical success, though a modest one. The bridgehead was only 3 miles deep and constantly under German counterattack, requiring the Combat Command to dig in and defend rather than continue advancing. But they were across the river, the first step in Third Army's planned winter offensive into Germany. General Patton visited the bridgehead on December 8th, walking among the foxholes and tank positions, talking to soldiers with that combination of profanity and encouragement that characterized his command style. He was pleased with the progress, he told General Newgarden, and Third Army would reinforce the bridgehead with additional divisions once they were available. In the meantime, the 10th Armored should hold what they had taken and prepare for the next phase of operations. What Patton didn't mention, what he himself didn't know, was that the strategic situation was about to change so dramatically that the Saar bridgehead would become irrelevant within a week. The winter offensive he was planning would be postponed indefinitely, and the 10th Armored Division would be needed somewhere else entirely. December 9th, 1944. Combat Command B, the division's most experienced formation after the Metz fighting, received orders that seemed like a gift. They were being rotated out of the line, sent to Luxembourg for rest and refit. The so-called Ghost Front in Luxembourg was the quietest sector of the entire Western Front. 80 miles of thinly held positions where both sides seemed content to maintain static defenses and avoid major combat. The decision to send CCB there made sense from a personnel management standpoint. The Combat Command had been fighting continuously for over a month, had taken heavy casualties, and needed time to absorb replacements and conduct maintenance on their battered equipment. Luxembourg was perfect for that, close enough to the front to maintain combat readiness, quiet enough to allow genuine rest. Colonel William Roberts, commanding CCB, briefed his officers on the move. They'd take over positions from an infantry division that was being moved south. They'd conduct light patrol activities to maintain contact with the Germans. And they'd use the time to train their replacements and get their equipment back to full operational status. It sounded almost like a vacation compared to what they'd been doing. The men of Combat Command B packed their gear, maintained their vehicles, and prepared for the move to Luxembourg with the kind of relief that came from knowing they were getting a break from combat. None of them suspected that Luxembourg was about to become the most dangerous place in Europe. December 12th, 1944. Berdorf, Luxembourg. A small village in the rolling countryside east of Luxembourg City, now home to elements of Combat Command B. The men settled into their positions, foxholes and tank revetments that previous units had dug, buildings that offered at least some protection from the December cold. The countryside was beautiful in a stark winter way. Forested hills and small villages connected by narrow roads, the kind of terrain that would have been pleasant under other circumstances. The front line was quiet, almost eerily so. German positions were visible across the valley, but there was little activity. Occasional patrol contacts, some artillery fire, when either side thought they'd spotted something worth shooting at, but nothing that suggested imminent combat. The men of CCB used the time well. Replacements who joined the division after Metz received intensive training from veterans. Tank crews conducted maintenance that had been deferred during continuous operations. Officers caught up on paperwork and planning. Some men even wrote Christmas letters home, discussing plans for leave in Paris or hoping the war might be over by next Christmas. In retrospect, the quiet should have been suspicious, but at the time, it just seemed like good fortune, a chance to recover before the next operation. December 15th, 1944, evening. The officers' mess in Berdorf, converted from a village schoolhouse, hosted a poker game that would be remembered by survivors as surreally normal. 6 officers from various CCB units sat around a table made from ammunition crates, playing 5-card draw with French francs as the stakes. The conversation was the kind of professional shop talk that characterized any military unit: discussions of tactics, complaints about supply problems, speculation about when they had returned to offensive operations. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The roads were icy, the sky was overcast, and weather forecasters were predicting continued poor conditions that would ground tactical aircraft for the foreseeable future. Around 2200 hours, someone noted distant artillery fire to the north. Not unusual, the front line was active farther north, and sound carried well in the cold air. What was unusual was the volume and duration. The artillery continued, a rumble that wouldn't stop, the kind of sustained barrage that suggested something more than routine harassment fire. One officer joked that the Germans must be celebrating something. Another suggested they were just burning up ammunition before winter made artillery operations more difficult. The poker game continued until midnight, when everyone turned in, unaware that what they were hearing was the German army registering its guns for the artillery preparation that would begin in 5.5 hours. The 10th Armored Division's dispositions on December 15th were a military planner's nightmare. Combat Command A was still in the Saar bridgehead, 3 miles across the river and under constant German pressure. Combat Command B was in Luxembourg, spread across 23 miles of front that should have required an entire division to defend properly. Combat Command Reserve, the division's 3rd major combat element, was in Thionville, France, technically held as a mobile reserve, but actually conducting its own operations to support 3rd Army's advance. Division headquarters was in Luxembourg City, positioned to coordinate operations, but actually just marking a point roughly equidistant from 3 scattered combat commands. This dispersion violated every principle of armored warfare. Armor was supposed to be concentrated for maximum effect, massed at decisive points to achieve breakthrough. Instead, the 10th Armored was stretched across 70 miles, its combat power divided into 3 pieces that couldn't easily support each other. The dispersion was a product of necessity. 3rd Army needed to hold a long front with limited forces, but it left the division vulnerable. If something happened, if German forces attacked in strength anywhere along that 70-mile arc, the 10th Armored would have to respond with whatever forces were nearest while trying to concentrate its scattered elements. That kind of response took time, required coordination, and assumed that communication systems would remain functional under stress. The intelligence picture on December 15th was simultaneously comprehensive and completely wrong. American intelligence officers knew a great deal about the German army facing them: unit designations, approximate strengths, defensive positions. What they didn't know was that the Germans had secretly concentrated 29 divisions in the Ardennes sector, including elite panzer and Volksgrenadier formations, for an offensive that would dwarf anything the Allies had anticipated. The intelligence failure wasn't about lack of effort. American intelligence officers had worked hard to understand German capabilities and intentions, but they'd made assumptions based on what seemed logical. The Germans were losing the war. They lacked fuel and ammunition for major operations. They needed to conserve forces for the defense of Germany itself. All of those assumptions were correct. What intelligence missed was that German high command had decided on a desperate gamble, committing resources to an offensive that, if successful, might split the Allied armies and force a negotiated settlement, and if unsuccessful, would waste forces desperately needed for Germany's defense. It was an irrational decision by rational standards, which is exactly why Allied intelligence didn't predict it. The sector that the 10th Armored was defending, and the wider area, including the Ardennes forest to the north, had been designated as a quiet zone, precisely because it seemed unsuitable for major operations. The terrain was broken, forested, laced with rivers and ridges that favored defenders. The roads were narrow and few, making it difficult to support large-scale armored operations. The weather in December was terrible, negating Allied air superiority. By logical military analysis, this was the last place anyone would launch a major offensive, which of course made it exactly the place to attack if you were trying to achieve surprise. The Germans had understood this. They'd chosen the Ardennes specifically because Allied planners had written it off as an unlikely attack sector. The concentration of forces had been done with elaborate deception measures, moving units at night, maintaining radio silence, spreading false intelligence about defensive preparations. The preparation had worked. On December 15th, 8th Corps, responsible for the Ardennes sector, reported to higher headquarters that there was no significant enemy activity opposite their positions. The report was filed at 1700 hours. 12 hours later, the largest German offensive of the war's final year would prove that assessment catastrophically wrong. December the 16th, 1944, 0530. The artillery barrage began. German guns, positioned with careful attention to concealment, opened fire across an 80-mile front. 1,400 guns firing in coordination, delivering high explosive and white phosphorus on American positions that had been carefully plotted on German maps. The barrage lasted 90 minutes, an eternity for soldiers caught in the open or in positions that offered inadequate protection. Combat Command B's positions in Luxembourg were hit. Though not as heavily as some sectors, the German artillery was focused farther north, where the main assault would go in, but CCB still received enough fire to make it clear this wasn't routine harassment. This was preparation for something, though what wasn't immediately clear. At 0700, the artillery stopped. The silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the barrage had been. Men emerged from cover, checking for casualties, trying to assess damage. Radio operators attempted to contact higher headquarters for information. Tank commanders climbed into their turrets and scanned forward positions through binoculars. And then, out of the winter darkness and ground fog, the German infantry came. The situation reports that reached division headquarters over the next 6 hours were fragmentary and confusing. CCB reported German attacks in their sector, strength unknown. 8th Corps headquarters reported major German assault across multiple sectors to the north. Radio communications were difficult, some circuits jammed by German interference, others simply overwhelmed by traffic. What was clear by noon on December 16th was that something very large was happening, that this was more than a local attack or a raid. What wasn't clear was the scale. Was this a major offensive? A limited objective attack? A spoiling attack meant to disrupt Allied plans? General Neugarten, trying to piece together a picture from incomplete information, faced a commander's nightmare. He had 3 combat commands in 3 different locations, German forces attacking somewhere in strength, and orders that still required him to hold the Saar bridgehead, while also responding to whatever was happening in Luxembourg. The phone call that came through at 1400 hours from 3rd Army headquarters would resolve some of that confusion while creating new problems. 3rd Army was ordering the 10th Armored Division to prepare to move north to respond to the German attack. But which elements? All of them? And move where exactly? When nobody yet understood what the Germans were trying to do. The quiet before the storm was over. The storm itself was beginning, and the 10th Armored Division was about to be tested in ways that Metz had never prepared them for. December 16th, 1944, 1100 hours. Division Headquarters, Luxembourg City. Colonel William Roberts, commanding Combat Command. B. stood before a map in the operations room, trying to understand an order that seemed to make no sense. The fragmentary order from 3rd Army Headquarters was brief. Move CCB to Bastogne immediately. Report to E8 Corps Commander for orders on arrival. That was it. No explanation of why, no intelligence about what they'd face, no guidance on mission or duration. Roberts knew where Bastogne was, a market town in Belgium, about 70 miles north of his current position, but he had no idea why it suddenly mattered. His operations officer was already calculating what moving the combat command that distance would require. They'd have to assemble their scattered units from positions across the Luxembourg sector, organize into march columns, coordinate with units that would take over their positions, and then move north on roads that were already jammed with traffic. The operations officer estimated 6 hours minimum to organize, then another 6 to 8 hours for the road march. Roberts looked at the map, at the narrow roads leading north, at the chaos that was likely building as multiple units tried to move simultaneously. He made a decision that would prove critical. "Start moving now," he told his staff. "We'll organize on the move. I want lead elements rolling within the hour." Organizing a combat command for movement was normally a deliberate process. Units had to be assembled in proper march order. Reconnaissance elements forward, followed by lead tank companies, then infantry, then supporting artillery and supply elements. Routes had to be coordinated to prevent traffic jams. Refueling had to be completed. But Roberts didn't have time for normal procedures. Whatever was happening at Bastogne was important enough for 3rd Army to issue immediate movement orders, which meant speed mattered more than proper organization. His battalion commanders received simple orders. Get your units on the road heading north. Worry about proper formation once you're moving. The result was organized chaos. Tank companies pulled out of their defensive positions and headed for assembly areas. Infantry loaded into half-tracks and trucks. Artillery batteries limbered their guns and moved to join the column. By 1300 hours, less than 2 hours after receiving the order, the first elements of Combat Command B were on the road north. They weren't properly organized, their march formation was improvised, and nobody was entirely sure what they'd find at Bastogne. But they were moving, and in the confusion of December 16th, movement was what mattered. The road march north was an education in chaos. The narrow Belgian roads were clogged with traffic moving in both directions. American units moving toward the sound of guns, Belgian civilians fleeing away from it, supply trucks trying to deliver ammunition and fuel to units that were no longer where they were supposed to be. Combat Command B's column stretched for miles, vehicles maintaining minimal distance to maximize speed, while trying to avoid the accidents that could bring the entire march to a halt. The temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that vehicles that stopped for more than a few minutes risked having their engines freeze. The roads were icy, making driving treacherous, and several vehicles slid off into ditches and had to be recovered. Roberts rode near the front of the column, monitoring radio reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. German forces were attacking across a wide front. American units were falling back. Fate. Corps headquarters had displaced from Bastogne to the west, which suggested the situation was deteriorating badly. And still, nobody could tell him what he was supposed to do when he arrived. The frustration of moving toward a crisis without understanding its nature was overwhelming. December 17th, 1944, 2100 hours. The lead elements of Combat Command B approached Bastogne from the south, and what they saw shook even experienced soldiers. The roads were jammed with American units retreating westward. the kind of confused, dispirited movement that characterized armies under severe pressure. Artillery units were moving with guns still limber-ed, no time to stop and set up defensive positions. Infantry marched in small groups, many without weapons or equipment, clearly separated from their units. Ambulances and trucks loaded with wounded moved slowly through the traffic. Officers tried to maintain order, but the retreat had a momentum of its own. Roberts and his lead tanks had to literally push through the retreating traffic to reach Bastogne, using their bulk to clear the road. What they found in the town was barely controlled chaos. 8. Corps headquarters was gone, evacuated west hours earlier. The acting corps commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division, was trying to establish a defensive perimeter with whatever units he could scrape together. The arrival of Combat Command B, a fully equipped armored combat command with 40 Sherman tanks, 12 M5 Stuart light tanks, 20 M18 tank destroyers, and 1,000 men, was the first good news McAuliffe had received all day. The briefing Roberts received from McAuliffe's staff was sobering. German forces had broken through American lines to the north and east of Bastogne and were advancing rapidly. The town was a critical road junction. 7 paved highways converged there, and whoever controlled it would control movement throughout the region. The Germans needed Bastogne to maintain their offensive's momentum. The Americans needed to hold it to prevent the Germans from exploiting their breakthrough. McAuliffe, whose Airborne Division had been rushed to Bastogne from reserve positions, had maybe 3,000 men to defend the town and its surrounding villages. Combat Command B's arrival doubled his combat power, but he still faced German forces that numbered in the tens of thousands. The situation was simple and desperate. Hold Bastogne against whatever the Germans threw at it, for as long as possible, until relief could arrive. When relief might come, or from where, nobody could say. Roberts asked the obvious question. What forces were immediately available to attack Bastogne? The intelligence officer's answer was chilling. Elements of at least 3 German divisions were within 5 miles of the town, with more approaching. The race to Bastogne was over. Combat Command B had won by hours, maybe less. Now they had to prove that winning the race mattered. December 18th, 1944, 0600 hours. Combat Command B had spent the night deploying to defensive positions south and southeast of Bastogne. Roberts, working with McAuliffe's staff, had identified the most likely German approach routes and positioned his forces to block them. Tank platoons dug into positions that gave them fields of fire across open ground. Infantry prepared strong points in villages that controlled key road junctions. Tank destroyers positioned themselves where they could cover multiple approaches. The defensive line wasn't continuous. CCB didn't have enough men to create a solid front, but it was organized around strong points that could cover each other with fire. The plan was based on what they'd learned at Metz. Use terrain, create mutually supporting positions, force the Germans to assault prepared defenses rather than allowing them to maneuver freely. As dawn broke on December 18th, the defenders of Bastogne's southern approaches could see German forces in the distance, moving west, seemingly oblivious to the American positions waiting for them. The first German assault came at 0900 hours. Elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, advancing on Bastogne from the east, ran into Combat Command B's positions at Ardennes, a small village 2 miles southeast of town. The German infantry, expecting light resistance at most, encountered prepared American positions with armor support. The firefight was sharp and one-sided. American tank guns and machine guns caught German infantry in the open, inflicting heavy casualties. German commanders, surprised to find strong resistance, pulled back to reorganize. They had expected to walk into Bastogne that morning. Instead, they'd discovered that American armor had arrived first and was dug in. The assault at Ardennes was probing, testing American strength and positions. The real attacks would come later, once the Germans understood what they were facing and brought up heavier forces. But that first contact achieved something critical. It bought time. Every hour the Germans spent organizing their assault was another hour for Bastogne's defenders to improve their positions, for reinforcements to arrive, for the defensive perimeter to solidify. The afternoon of December 18th brought the realization of just how desperate the situation was. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces were flowing past Bastogne to the north and south, bypassing the town rather than attacking it immediately. This was tactically sound for the Germans. Why waste time and forces reducing a strong point when you could bypass it and continue the advance? But it also meant Bastogne was being surrounded. By 1500 hours, the last road west was under German fire. By 1700 hours, that road was cut entirely. Bastogne was encircled. Combat Command B and the 101st Airborne Division, along with various supporting units, were now surrounded by German forces that outnumbered them by at least 5-1. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medical materials were whatever they'd brought with them, or whatever was already in Bastogne's depots. Reinforcement was impossible. The only question was how long they could hold before being overwhelmed. December 18th, 1944, evening. Colonel Roberts gathered his battalion commanders for a meeting that was equal parts planning session and morale boost. The situation was clear to everyone. They were surrounded, outnumbered, cut off. Under normal circumstances, surrounded forces either broke out or surrendered, but these weren't normal circumstances. Third Army was already moving north to relieve Bastogne, Roberts told them, though he had no specific information about timing or routes. Their job was to hold the southern approaches to Bastogne to prevent German forces from taking the town for as long as it took relief to arrive. How long might that be? Days, certainly, possibly a week or more. Could they hold that long? Roberts looked at his officers, men who'd fought through Metz, who'd adapted tactics and survived against experienced enemies, and gave them the answer that would define Combat Command B's next week. We held Metz for 2 weeks against prepared defenses. Now we're the prepared defense. The Germans are going to discover that taking Bastogne from us is harder than they think. The confidence was partly real, partly performance. Roberts knew the odds they faced, but he also knew that morale mattered, that soldiers who believed they could hold usually found a way to do exactly that. The question wasn't whether they could hold indefinitely, they couldn't, but whether they could hold long enough. That answer would be written in the frozen fields and small villages around Bastogne over the next 8 days. The road march from Luxembourg to Bastogne covered 73 miles and took 19 hours, including brief stops for refueling and mechanical repairs. Combat Command B had moved from comfortable rear area positions to the center of the war's largest battle in less than a day. They had arrived with minimal information, no time for reconnaissance, and orders that amounted to, "Hold this town." In the chaotic first days of the Battle of the Bulge, when American forces across the Ardennes sector were retreating or surrendering, Combat Command B's rapid movement to Bastogne and immediate organization of effective defenses stood out as exceptional. Later analysis would show that they'd won the race to Bastogne by approximately 4 hours. German forces could have seized the town on December the 17th if American armor hadn't arrived when it did. Those 4 hours, purchased by Colonel Roberts' decision to start moving immediately rather than organizing first, would prove to be some of the most important hours of the entire battle. The siege of Bastogne, the battle that would capture American imagination and define the Bulge in popular memory, was possible only because Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division had gotten there first. What they would do in the days ahead would validate that race and prove that sometimes winning by hours was enough. December 17th, 1944. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, France. The morning briefing began with General Dwight Eisenhower's intelligence officer presenting a map that showed German penetrations across an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. Red arrows indicated German advances, some already 10 miles deep into American-held territory. Blue unit symbols showed American formations, many marked with question marks indicating their status was unknown. Eisenhower studied the map silently for several minutes, and his staff officers waited for his assessment. What the Supreme Commander saw was either a local German counterattack or something much worse. The intelligence officer's preliminary estimate suggested the Germans had committed at least 15 divisions to the offensive, possibly more. That wasn't a counterattack. That was a major operation. the kind that required months of planning and significant resource commitment. Eisenhower made two decisions in that briefing that would shape the Allied response. First, this was to be treated as a major German offensive, not a local problem. Second, he wanted reserves moved immediately to contain the penetration, particularly armor that could respond quickly. The 10th Armored Division was among the first units mentioned. They were experienced, well-equipped, and positioned where they could respond quickly. Eisenhower's chief of staff made a note: alert 3rd Army, 10th Armored to highest readiness. The scale of the German offensive was becoming clear to American commanders through a combination of frontline reports and strategic inference. By midday December the 17th, SIBO seat. Corps headquarters had identified German units from at least 3 corps, indicating that this was an army-level operation, not a divisional counterattack. More concerning, the Germans were advancing rapidly, exploiting gaps in American defenses that had been created by stretching too few units across too much front. The Ardennes sector, so quiet for so long, had become a breakthrough zone. German panzer divisions were racing west, trying to reach the Meuse River before American reinforcements could establish defensive positions. The whole shape of the Western Front was changing by the hour, transforming from static lines to fluid battle where mobility and quick decision-making mattered more than prepared positions. For the 10th Armored Division, scattered across 3 locations and engaged in different missions, the news created immediate complications. They were needed in the Bulge, but which elements and where and doing what? December the 17th, 1944, Combat Command. A positions, Saar Bridgehead. The combat command that had fought so hard to establish positions across the Saar River received orders that seemed incomprehensible. Hold in place, defend the bridgehead against German counterattacks, do not withdraw. Lieutenant Colonel Miles Standish, commanding CCA, read the orders and immediately protested to division headquarters. His combat command was holding an advanced position that had made sense when 3rd Army was planning an offensive into Germany. But, with German forces breaking through to the north, the Saar bridgehead was suddenly irrelevant. An exposed position that tied down 1/3 of the division's combat power for no strategic purpose. Division headquarters agreed, but couldn't change the orders. 3rd Army needed to maintain the appearance of offensive operations in the Saar sector to prevent German forces there from reinforcing the Ardennes attack. Combat Command A would stay where they were, would continue defending their bridgehead, even as the rest of their division moved north to fight a different battle. The frustration among CCA's officers and men was intense. They could hear from radio reports that the main battle was happening elsewhere, that their division was being committed piece by piece, and they were stuck defending ground that no longer mattered. December the 17th, 1944, afternoon. Combat Command Reserve. The division's 3rd major element received orders that were clearer but equally challenging. CCR would move north toward the German breakthrough zone, specifically toward Echternach, a historic town where German forces were attempting to establish bridgeheads across the Saar River. The mission was to block German exploitation, to prevent enemy forces from breaking out of their initial penetration zone and threatening Luxembourg City. Unlike Combat Command B's race to Bastogne, CCR's movement was planned as a deliberate deployment to prepared positions. They had time to organize properly, to coordinate their movement, to ensure they arrived combat ready. But they also had a different challenge. They'd be operating independently, separated from the rest of the division, fighting their own battle while CCB fought at Bastogne and CCA defended the Saar. For a division that had trained to operate as a cohesive unit, this dispersion was the opposite of everything they had learned. Armor was supposed to be concentrated. Instead, the 10th Armored was being scattered across 100 miles, its combat power divided into isolated pieces. December 19th, 1944, Gazero, 800 hours. Division headquarters, Luxembourg City. General Newgarden stood before his operations map and confronted a situation that would have seemed impossible 3 days earlier. His division was now fighting on the 3 separate fronts. Combat Command B was surrounded in Bastogne under heavy attack from multiple German divisions. Combat Command A was defending the Saar bridgehead against German forces trying to eliminate it. Combat Command Reserve was deploying to Echternach to block German advance south. The three combat commands were separated by distances ranging from 37 to 43 miles. Communication was by radio only, as German advances had cut telephone lines. Division headquarters itself was surrounded on three sides by German forces, connected to friendly lines only by a narrow corridor that was under constant pressure. Supporting units, artillery, engineers, supply, were scattered across the region, some able to support multiple combat commands, others isolated with just one. On the map, the 10th Armored Division's unit symbol appeared in three locations, connected by dotted lines that represented not physical connections, but administrative relationships that were becoming increasingly theoretical. The challenges of commanding a division spread across three battles were immense. Each combat command faced different threats and needed different support. CCB needed ammunition and medical supplies, but couldn't be resupplied directly because Bastogne was surrounded. CCA needed engineer support to maintain their bridgehead defenses, but the engineer battalion was split between multiple locations. CCR needed artillery support, but the division's artillery battalions were positioned to support positions that were no longer relevant. Normal division-level coordination, moving units between combat commands to reinforce success or shore up weak points, was impossible because moving forces between commands required crossing German-held territory. Newgarden had become a division commander with three separate commands that he could communicate with but couldn't support effectively, couldn't coordinate directly, couldn't even visit personally. His staff worked around the clock to maintain some semblance of unity, using radio networks to pass information between combat commands, coordinating with 3rd Army to provide supply and reinforcement where possible, tracking the tactical situation in three separate battles simultaneously. December 19th, 1944, afternoon. 3rd Army Headquarters. Staff officers prepared situation maps for General Patton's evening briefing, and one map anomaly caught everyone's attention. The 10th Armored Division's unit symbol appeared in three locations: Bastogne, the Saar, and Echternach. A colonel from the operations section assumed it was a mapping error and began to correct it. Another officer stopped him and explained, "No, that's correct. The division really is in three places simultaneously." Patton, reviewing the map later, made a notation that captured the situation's uniqueness. The 10th Armored is holding three critical positions with a force that should be concentrated at one. Either they're about to be destroyed piecemeal, or they're going to prove that good divisions can do impossible things. We'll find out which in the next week. The assessment was accurate. Military doctrine said, divided forces invited defeat in detail. The enemy could concentrate against isolated elements and destroy them one at a time. But doctrine assumed the enemy could move forces freely to achieve that concentration. In the confused first days of the Bulge, German forces were committed to specific objectives and couldn't easily shift to exploit American dispersion. The question was whether the 10th Armored could maintain effective defense in three locations before German commanders realized the opportunity they'd been given. December 19th, 1944, evening. The German perspective on the 10th Armored Division's dispersion was fragmentary and confused, much like American understanding of German dispositions. German commanders knew they were facing American armor in multiple locations. Their intelligence had identified the 10th Armored before the offensive, but they hadn't realized that what they were fighting were separated elements of a single division. 5th Panzer Army was focused on Bastogne and the American forces defending it, but their intelligence classified those forces as mixed elements from multiple units, rather than recognizing that Combat Command B represented a third of an entire armored division. 7th Army, attacking in the south, knew they were facing American armor at Echternach, but had classified it as probably a separate tank battalion or combat command, not realizing it was CCR of the 10th Armored. The Saar front, where CCA was defending, was considered a separate operation entirely, not connected to the Bulge. German intelligence hadn't put together that the same division they had identified as a threat before the offensive was now fighting them in three places simultaneously. This intelligence failure worked to the Americans' advantage. If German commanders had realized that they were facing divided elements of a single division, they might have concentrated forces to destroy those elements individually. Instead, they treated each engagement as separate, allowing the 10th Armored's combat commands to hold independently. The strategic situation by late December 19th was developing in ways that would determine the battle's outcome. German forces had achieved significant penetrations, but hadn't reached their objectives. The critical road junctions they needed, Bastogne especially, remained in American hands. American reinforcements were flowing toward the battle, but slowly, constrained by winter weather and congested roads. The question was whether German offensive momentum could overcome American defensive resilience before reinforcements arrived in sufficient strength. For the 10th Armored Division, the answer to that question depended on whether 3 isolated combat commands could hold their positions long enough for the strategic situation to shift. CCB had to hold Bastogne against sustained assault. CCA had to maintain the Saar bridgehead to prevent German reinforcement from that sector. CCR had to block German exploitation toward Luxembourg City. None of these missions was individually decisive, but collectively, they shaped the battle's geography and timing in ways that would prove critical. December 20th, 1944. The full scope of the 10th Armored Division's situation was becoming clear to everyone from division staff to individual soldiers. They were fighting 3 separate battles with no prospect of mutual support. Communication between combat commands was possible but difficult. Radio signals sometimes blocked by terrain or German jamming. Supply was problematic, with each combat command dependent on whatever had been with them when the battle started, plus whatever could be pushed forward through increasingly contested supply lines. Medical evacuation was challenging, particularly for CCB and surrounded Bastogne. Personnel replacement was impossible. Men killed or wounded couldn't be replaced, meaning each combat command's strength was steadily eroding. Maintenance on vehicles had to be performed in combat conditions, under fire, with limited spare parts. Every aspect of sustaining combat operations was harder because the division was split, and yet, somehow, they were holding. Not advancing, not winning in any conventional sense, but holding their positions and preventing German forces from achieving their objectives. The division that had almost been disbanded before deployment, that had fought one major battle at Metz before the Bulge, was now demonstrating the value of thorough training and tactical flexibility. They weren't just surviving dispersion, they were maintaining effectiveness despite it, proving that a well-trained division could function even when every principle of doctrine said it shouldn't work. The next days would test whether that effectiveness could be sustained under the mounting pressure of German assaults and the accumulating costs of combat in 3 isolated locations simultaneously. December 19th, 1944. Verdun, France. The city where French and German armies had bled each other nearly white in 1916 now hosted a meeting that would determine the Allied response to Germany's Ardennes offensive. General Dwight Eisenhower had summoned his senior commanders to this hastily arranged conference, and the mood in the room reflected the gravity of the situation. The Germans had achieved surprise, had penetrated American lines, and were threatening to split the Allied armies. Eisenhower went around the table asking each commander when they could launch counterattacks to contain the German advance. When he reached General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, the question was more specific. 3rd Army would have to wheel 90 degrees north and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. How quickly could Patton move? The question seemed designed to pressure Patton into committing to an aggressive timeline. Instead, Patton's answer shocked the room into silence. I can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd. 3 days. Patton was proposing to turn an entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of vehicles, 90 degrees and attack into a major battle in 72 hours. Every other commander in that room knew what such a movement required. It was barely possible, maybe impossible, certainly risky. Eisenhower asked if Patton was serious. Patton's response would define the Allied counteroffensive. I've already issued preparatory orders. My staff has been working on movement plans since December 17th. We're ready to move. The movement Patton was proposing would be the largest rapid redeployment in American military history. 3rd Army would disengage from its current operations in the Saar sector, turn north, move 50 to 100 miles depending on unit locations, and attack into the southern flank of German forces that were still advancing west. The maneuver required moving 133,178 vehicles, 62,000 tons of supplies, and coordinating the movements of 6 divisions over icy roads in winter weather. The risk was enormous. If the movement got tangled, if units couldn't move as quickly as planned, if German forces detected the movement and repositioned to counter it, the entire Third Army could be caught strung out on roads and destroyed piecemeal. But Patton had been thinking about exactly this kind of maneuver for months, had wargamed similar scenarios, had positioned his headquarters staff to do exactly the kind of rapid planning that such operations required. More importantly, he'd already identified which units would lead the attack, and first among them was the 10th Armored Division. Not all of it. Parts of the division were already committed at Bastogne and Echternach, but whatever elements could be freed up would be at the spearhead of Third Army's drive to relieve Bastogne. December 20th, 1944, 0800 hours, Third Army Headquarters. Patton's chief of staff was briefing division commanders on the Third Army's movement and attack plan. The briefing was detailed, covering movement routes, timelines, objectives, support arrangements. But one element of the plan immediately caused concern among the assembled commanders. The success of Third Army's attack depended on the 10th Armored Division maintaining multiple defensive positions, even while other elements of the division were being repositioned for offensive operations. Specifically, Combat Command B had to hold Bastogne indefinitely, tying down German forces that would otherwise be available to oppose Third Army's advance. Combat Command A had to continue defending the Saar bridgehead to prevent German forces in that sector from reinforcing the Ardennes battle. Combat Command Reserve would hold Echternach to prevent German exploitation eastward. Only division headquarters and supporting units would be immediately available for offensive operations, and even those would have to be reconstituted into provisional combat commands using whatever forces could be scraped together. One commander voiced what everyone was thinking. You're asking the 10th Armored to defend in 3 locations and attack in a 4th simultaneously. That's not a division, that's 4 separate battles. Patton's response to that concern revealed his understanding of what made certain units capable of exceptional performance. The 10th Armored is the best trained division in Third Army. They've proven at Metz that they can adapt doctrine and handle difficult missions. Now I'm asking them to do something harder, operate dispersed, hold critical positions, and still contribute to offensive operations. Can they do it? Probably. Will it cost them heavily? Certainly. But I need Bastogne held, I need those other positions maintained, and I need them to hold until my relief force can get there. I've told General Newgarden that his division has to buy me 4 days minimum. He said he'd give me a week. I believe him. The exchange captured Patton's approach to command. Identify your best units. Ask them to do things that seem impossible. Trust that their training and leadership will find ways to make it work. It was an approach that got results, but also consumed units quickly, burning through their strength and cohesion in pursuit of operational objectives. The 10th Armored was about to discover the cost of being Patton's most trusted division. December 21st, 1944. Patton made a personal visit to 10th Armored Division headquarters in Luxembourg City, traveling forward despite the tactical situation. The meeting with General Newgarden was private, but Patton's aide recorded the key exchange. Patton, I need your division to do something that violates every principle of armored warfare. You're going to stay dispersed, fight 3 separate battles, and hold your positions no matter what it costs. Other divisions will do the attacking. Your job is to be the anvil while I bring the hammer. Can you do it? Newgarden's response was carefully considered. We can hold our current positions. CCB is in good shape at Bastogne, well positioned and getting stronger every day they have to prepare defenses. CCA is solid in the Saar. They've been fighting there for weeks and know the ground. CCR is deploying to Echternach and should be in position by tomorrow. The challenge isn't holding. We can do that. The challenge is sustainment. We're cut into 3 pieces. Supply is difficult. Replacements are impossible. Every casualty we take reduces our strength permanently until the division can be reconsolidated. If you need us to hold for a week, we'll hold, but we'll come out of this significantly reduced in combat power. Patton's acknowledgement of what he was asking the 10th Armored to do was characteristically blunt. His response to Newgarden's assessment went into Patton's personal diary. Written that evening, "I've asked the 10th Armored to sacrifice themselves holding positions that other divisions should be defending. They'll do it because they're professionals, and because they understand that sometimes units have to accept terrible costs for operational objectives. In a rational world, I'd concentrate the 10th Armored for an attack role. That's what armor is for. But we're not in a rational world. We're in a crisis where I need forces positioned to contain German penetrations while I organize a counterattack. The 10th Armored is in the right positions, has proven themselves capable, and most importantly, I trust them to hold when other units might break. That trust is going to cost them at least 40 to 60% casualties if they have to hold for a full week. But if they do hold, they'll save 3rd Army and possibly the entire Bulge front. That's worth a division." The calculation was cold but honest. Patton was gambling that one division's sacrifice could buy time for an entire army to respond effectively. December 22nd, 1944. 3rd Army's counteroffensive began with 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, and 80th Infantry Division attacking north toward Bastogne. The movement had gone remarkably smoothly. Patton's staff had performed near miracles of coordination, moving divisions into position on time, establishing supply lines, coordinating artillery support. The 10th Armored Division's role in this offensive was limited. They were already committed to defensive operations, but critical. As long as CCB held Bastogne, the town remained a German objective that absorbed forces the Wehrmacht needed elsewhere. As long as CCA held the Saar bridgehead, German divisions in that sector couldn't be pulled out to reinforce the Ardennes battle. As long as CCR held Echternach, 3rd Army's northern flank was secure. The 10th Armored wasn't attacking, wasn't advancing, wasn't doing what armored divisions were designed to do, but they were enabling everyone else's operations by maintaining positions that shaped the battlefield's geometry. The next 4 days, December 22nd through December 25th, would test Patton's gamble to its limits. 3rd Army's relief force made progress, but slower than planned. German resistance was fiercer than expected. Winter weather grounded tactical aircraft that were supposed to support the advance. The corridor 3rd Army was trying to open to Bastogne remained narrow and contested, and all the while, the 10th Armored Division's 3 combat commands faced mounting pressure. CCB and Bastogne endured daily assaults from German forces that outnumbered them 5-1. CCA and the Saar bridgehead fought off multiple German attacks aimed at eliminating that position. CCR at Echternach held against German attempts to break through toward Luxembourg. Each combat command was fighting its own battle, unable to support the others, steadily consuming ammunition and medical supplies, taking casualties that couldn't be replaced. The division was bleeding, its strength eroding day by day. But it was holding. Every day the 3 combat commands maintained their positions was another day that 3rd Army's relief force moved closer to Bastogne, another day that German offensive momentum dissipated. Christmas Day, 1944. 3rd Army's 4th Armored Division was still fighting to reach Bastogne, still 5 miles short, still facing determined German resistance. In Bastogne itself, Combat Command B was enduring its heaviest attacks yet, German forces throwing everything available at the town's defenses. At division headquarters in Luxembourg City, General Newgarden received an update on casualties across his 3 scattered combat commands. 893 total casualties since December 16th, including 161 killed. The division had lost 43 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Combat Command B alone had sustained over 400 casualties, reducing its effective strength by 40%. And the battle wasn't over. Relief hadn't arrived. The combat commands were still under attack. Patton's 4-day timeline had stretched to 6 days and was approaching 7. Newgarden's promise to give Patton a week was being fulfilled, but at a cost that was approaching the limits of what the division could sustain. The gamble that one division's sacrifice could buy time for an army's response was working. But gambles, even successful ones, have costs. The 10th Armored Division was paying that cost in the frozen fields and small towns where its scattered combat commands were learning that sometimes Holding position against overwhelming odds is harder and more important than any attack. Patton's decision to use the 10th Armored Division as his anvil during the Bulge was based on a calculation about which units could be trusted with the hardest missions. The division had proven itself at Metz. They had demonstrated tactical flexibility and resilience. They had shown they could adapt to unexpected challenges. But Patton's real reason for trusting them with this mission was simpler. They were already there. Dispersion that seemed like a weakness, the division scattered across 3 locations, became a strength when those 3 locations suddenly became critical defensive positions. Any other division would have needed days to move into position. The 10th Armored was already positioned, already engaged, already doing what Patton needed done. His gamble wasn't that they'd do the impossible. His gamble was that they'd do the extremely difficult for long enough that it would matter. By Christmas Day, that gamble was paying off. But the bill for that success was written in the casualty reports that crossed division headquarters every morning, in the strength estimates that showed combat commands eroding toward ineffectiveness, in the knowledge that every day of successful defense was purchased with losses the division might not recover from. The question was no longer whether the 10th Armored could hold. They'd proven they could. The question was how much of the division would be left when relief finally arrived and they could count the full cost of being Patton's most trusted unit. December 19th, 1944, 0600 hours, Longueville, Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry stood in the pre-dawn darkness, studying a map by flashlight, trying to understand an order that made no tactical sense. His task force, designated Team Cherry and comprising 500 men, 15 Sherman tanks, and elements of the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion, had been ordered to hold Longueville, a small village 5 miles east of Bastogne. The order was simple: prevent German forces from using the road through Longueville to reach Bastogne. How long should he hold? Indefinitely? With what support? Whatever you have with you. Cherry folded the map and looked at his officers. They had arrived at Longueville 3 hours earlier, part of Combat Command B's hasty deployment to defend Bastogne's approaches. Now, as dawn approached, they could hear vehicle noises to the east. German forces were approaching, and Cherry's small task force was the only thing between them and Bastogne. He'd trained for 2 years, fought at Metz, learned tactical flexibility the hard way. Nothing in that experience had prepared him for what he was about to face. Defending an indefensible position against overwhelming odds with the full knowledge that retreat wasn't an option because the road he was defending was the road Bastogne's defenders needed to keep closed. The village of Longueville sat at a crossroads controlling access to Bastogne from the east. The terrain was gently rolling farmland, offering little in the way of natural defensive advantages. The village itself consisted of perhaps 30 stone buildings clustered around the road junction, with scattered farm structures on the approaches. Team Cherry had occupied positions during the night, placing tanks in hold-down positions where terrain allowed, positioning infantry in buildings that offered fields of fire across likely German approach routes. It wasn't much of a defensive position, but Cherry had learned at Metz that the quality of the position mattered less than how you used it. His tanks were positioned to create crossfire zones. His infantry had prepared buildings for defense, knocking out windows and walls to create firing ports. His small engineering detachment had planted mines on likely vehicle approaches and prepared demolitions on bridges that might need to be destroyed. In 6 hours of darkness, Team Cherry had transformed Longueville from a sleepy Belgian village into something that might, with luck and skill, slow down a German advance. December 19th, 1944, 0730. The Germans arrived. What Cherry had heard during the night wasn't reconnaissance elements or advance guards. It was the 2nd Panzer Division, 13,000 men and 120 tanks, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations. They'd been advancing all night, racing west toward the Meuse River, and Longueville was just another small village to pass through on their way. The German lead elements, a company of Panzer Grenadiers mounted in half-tracks, with several Mark IV tanks providing support, approached Longueville expecting token resistance at most. What they got was a carefully orchestrated ambush. Cherry's lead tank platoon waited until the German column was within 400 yards, close enough that misses were unlikely. The opening volley destroyed 2 German half-tracks and damaged 1 Mark IV. German infantry scattered, seeking cover. German tanks returned fire, but they were shooting at hull-down Shermans with only their turrets exposed, a difficult target. The firefight lasted 20 minutes before the German company withdrew to reorganize. Team Cherry had won the first engagement, but everyone in Longueville knew what it meant. The Germans hadn't expected resistance. Now they knew American armor was here. They'd come back with more force. The pattern of the next 48 hours was established in that first contact. German forces would probe Team Cherry's positions, be repulsed, withdraw, and return with heavier forces. Each engagement cost the Germans casualties and time. Each engagement also cost Team Cherry, slowly eroding their strength. By noon on December 19th, Cherry had lost 2 tanks and 30 men. By evening, 3 more tanks were destroyed, and casualties had climbed to 80. German artillery had found their positions, making movement dangerous. German infantry had infiltrated into buildings on Longueville's outskirts, forcing constant clearing operations. But the village was still in American hands and the road to Bastogne remained closed. 5 miles to the west, Combat Command B and the 101st Airborne Division were using that time to strengthen Bastogne's defenses. Every hour that Team Cherry held was another hour that Bastogne's defenders had to prepare for the siege that was coming. December 20th, 1944. Dawn. Team Cherry woke to discover they were surrounded. During the night, German forces had bypassed Longueville to the north and south, continuing their advance west. The 2nd Panzer Division's main body had moved past without attacking, leaving rearguard elements to reduce the American position. Team Cherry was now an island in German-held territory, cut off from friendly forces, supplied only by what they had brought with them. Radio communication with Combat Command B headquarters in Bastogne was intermittent, German jamming making contact difficult. Cherry's morning situation report was grim. 12 operational tanks remaining of 15 original, 362 men of 500 original, ammunition down to 40%. No possibility of resupply. The headquarters response was brief. Hold as long as possible. Your position is critical to Bastogne defense. There was no mention of relief, no suggestion that help was coming. The message was clear. Team Cherry was on their own, and their mission was to die in place if that's what it took to buy Bastogne more time. The German assault on December 20th was methodical and overwhelming. Elements of Panzer Lehr Division had reinforced the 2nd Panzer Division's rear guard, bringing the total German force surrounding Longueville to roughly 4,000 men and 60 tanks. The Germans, having learned that direct assault against Team Cherry's positions was costly, shifted to siege tactics. Artillery pounded Longueville continuously, methodically destroying buildings, forcing American infantry to constantly relocate. German infantry probed for weak points, trying to identify which positions were still strongly held and which had been weakened by casualties. German tanks maneuvered at long range, taking shots at any American vehicle that exposed itself. The Americans responded by contracting their perimeter, pulling back from outlying positions to concentrate their remaining strength in Longueville's center. By evening, December 20th, Team Cherry held an area roughly 400 yards square, surrounded by German forces on all sides, under constant fire, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting. They'd been ordered to hold indefinitely. They'd held for 40 hours. The question was whether they could hold any longer. December 21st, 1944. The day began with a German surrender demand delivered under a white flag. A German officer speaking perfect English explained that Team Cherry was surrounded by overwhelming forces, that continued resistance was pointless, that surrender under such circumstances was honorable. Lieutenant Colonel Cherry listened to the offer, considered it for perhaps 30 seconds, and delivered his response: "If you want Longueville, come take it." The German officer withdrew, and 30 minutes later, German artillery resumed with renewed intensity. The surrender offer had been genuine. The Germans wanted to avoid the time and casualties required to reduce the American position, but it had also been a test of American resolve. Cherry's refusal told the Germans that Longueville would have to be taken by force, that the Americans weren't ready to quit. For the men of Team Cherry, their commander's defiance was both inspiring and sobering. They weren't getting out of this. The best they could hope for was to inflict enough damage on German forces that their sacrifice would matter. The fighting on December 21st was the most intense yet. German forces, having failed to get American surrender, launched a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously. Panzer Grenadiers supported by tanks hit Team Cherry's perimeter at 0900 hours. The assault was professional and aggressive, the kind of combined arms attack that German armor had perfected over 5 years of war. American defenses held, but barely. Machine gun positions were overrun and had to be retaken. 2 more Sherman tanks were destroyed by German Panzerfaust rockets fired from close range. American infantry, down to small arms ammunition, began rationing their fire, shooting only when targets were certain. By mid-afternoon, Team Cherry's perimeter had contracted again, now holding just the village center. Casualties had climbed past 300. Ammunition for the remaining tanks was down to 5 rounds per gun. Medical supplies were exhausted, the aid station overwhelmed. And still the Germans came, wave after wave, taking casualties but pressing forward, determined to eliminate this American position that was costing them time and men. December 22nd, 1944, evening. Team Cherry had been holding Longueville for 72 hours. Of the 500 men who'd started the defense, fewer than 200 were still combat effective. Of 15 tanks, 4 remained operational. The village itself was rubble, every building damaged or destroyed by artillery fire. The American perimeter had contracted to perhaps 100 yards square. A handful of shattered buildings defended by exhausted men who'd been fighting continuously for 3 days. Radio contact with Bastogne was lost, German jamming finally overwhelming American communications. Team Cherry was effectively isolated, cut off not just physically but informationally. They had no idea whether Bastogne still held, whether their sacrifice was buying anything, whether relief was coming. All they knew was that Germans were still attacking and they were still fighting back. The mission was to hold indefinitely. They were still holding. That was all that mattered. December the 23rd, 1944, 0200 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Cherry made the decision that probably saved what was left of his command. Further defense was impossible. The remaining tanks were out of ammunition. Infantry small arms ammunition was nearly exhausted. Casualties couldn't be evacuated or even properly treated. The Germans would overrun the position at dawn, and continuing to defend would just mean dying for ground that couldn't be held. Cherry's decision, attempt to break out, fight through German lines on foot, try to reach Bastogne 5 miles away. The men who could walk, 60 able-bodied soldiers and perhaps 20 walking wounded, would attempt the breakout. The seriously wounded, 120 men who couldn't be moved, would have to be left behind with a medical officer to surrender them to German forces. It was the nightmare scenario every commander dreaded, abandoning wounded men because taking them would doom everyone. Cherry's orders were simple: move in small groups, avoid German positions where possible, fight through where necessary, every man for himself once they were past German lines. At 0300 hours, in darkness and freezing rain, the survivors of Team Cherry abandoned Longueville and began infiltrating through German positions toward Bastogne. The breakout was chaos. Small groups of American soldiers moved through darkness, trying to avoid German positions, sometimes stumbling into German units and fighting brief, vicious firefights before breaking contact. Some groups got lost in the darkness and ended up moving away from Bastogne, eventually being captured or killed. Other groups ran into German ambushes and were wiped out. Cherry himself led one group of 20 men, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, fighting through 2 German positions during the 5-mile journey. By dawn on December 23rd, stragglers began reaching American lines around Bastogne. Throughout the morning, more arrived. The final count: 60 survivors of Team Cherry's 500 men reached Bastogne. 12 tanks destroyed, 3 abandoned when ammunition ran out. 380 casualties, most left behind in Longueville when the breakout began. Cherry's after-action report, written 2 days later when exhaustion and shock had worn off enough to let him write coherently, contained one sentence that captured everything. We didn't hold Longueville. We died there. The sacrifice of Team Cherry bought Bastogne 48 critical hours. From December 19th, when they first engaged German forces, until December 21st, when the last organized defense collapsed, Team Cherry had forced the 2nd Panzer Division and elements of Panzer Lehr to commit forces to reducing their position. Those forces, estimated at 4,000 men and 60 tanks at various points during the siege, couldn't be used to assault Bastogne. The time Team Cherry bought allowed Combat Command B and the 101st Airborne to dig in, to establish interlocking fields of fire, to mine approaches, to transform Bastogne from a town into a fortress. German commanders later acknowledged that if Longueville had fallen on December 19th, when first contacted, they would have assaulted Bastogne that same day with forces that weren't committed to the Longueville fight. Whether that assault would have succeeded is unknowable. What is known is that Team Cherry's defense denied the Germans the opportunity to try. 500 men had held for 4 days against forces 20 times their strength. They'd inflicted an estimated 900 German casualties and destroyed or damaged 28 German tanks and 47 other vehicles. The casualty ratio, 500 American casualties to 900 German, wasn't impressive by normal standards, but normal standards didn't apply. Team Cherry's mission wasn't to win. It was to delay, to absorb German combat power, to buy time measured in hours when hours were what Bastogne's defenders needed most. The story of Team Cherry's stand at Longueville was almost lost to history. In the larger narrative of Bastogne's siege, the defense of the town itself overshadowed the outlying actions that made that defense possible. The survivors, scattered across various units after their breakout, didn't talk much about what they had experienced. Lieutenant Colonel Cherry's after-action report was filed in division records and largely forgotten. It wasn't until after the war, when historians began piecing together the full timeline of the Bastogne siege, that Team Cherry's role became clear. They'd fought a battle that military doctrine said they should have lost in hours. They'd held against overwhelming odds not through superior equipment or numbers, but through tactical skill, courage, and the grim understanding that their sacrifice served a purpose larger than their survival. The phrase, "we died there," captured something essential about the nature of the desperate defensive combat. Team Cherry hadn't died physically, 60 men survived, but they'd died as a functioning military unit, had been destroyed, accomplishing their mission. That destruction bought time, and time bought victory. It was a transaction that the men who made it understood intellectually, but that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They'd done what was asked of them. The cost of doing it was everything. December 23rd, 1944, 0700 hours. Bastogne, Belgium. Combat Command B's command post, established in a stone building near the town center that offered minimal protection from German artillery. Colonel William Roberts stood before a map, covered with symbols representing American and German positions. The symbols told a story of steady German pressure on all sides of Bastogne's perimeter. The town had been surrounded for 5 days. Radio intercepts suggested German reinforcements were arriving. Every approach road was cut, and yet, somehow, the defenses were holding. Roberts was explaining the situation to his battalion commanders, but really, he was trying to convince himself that the situation was sustainable. The Germans are attacking piecemeal, he told them. They're committing forces as they arrive, rather than waiting to mass for a coordinated assault. That's our advantage. As long as they attack in sequence rather than simultaneously, we can shift reserves to threaten sectors. One of his commanders asked the obvious question: how long could they maintain that advantage? Roberts' answer was honest. Until we run out of ammunition, medical supplies, or men, in approximately that order. The dawn of December 23rd brought something Bastogne's defenders hadn't seen in days: clear sky. The fog and overcast that had blanketed the Ardennes since the offensive began had lifted, and for the first time, Allied aircraft could operate. The sound of aircraft engines, Allied engines, was the first good news the defenders had received all week. C-47 transport planes, protected by fighter escorts, began dropping supplies by parachute into the shrinking space inside Bastogne's perimeter. The first drop at 0900 hours brought ammunition, desperately needed after 5 days of continuous combat. Subsequent drops brought medical supplies, food, and more ammunition. Some parachutes drifted outside the American perimeter and were recovered by German forces, but most fell where intended. For Combat Command B's tankers, the resupply meant they could actually fire their guns again without rationing every round. For infantry, it meant enough ammunition to repel attacks without worrying about running dry. Most importantly, it meant they weren't alone. The airdrops were visible proof that someone outside Bastogne knew they were still fighting and was trying to help. The German assault on Christmas Eve was the most determined yet. Intelligence had warned that the Germans were preparing a major effort, and the attack began at 0800 hours with an artillery barrage that lasted 30 minutes. Then came the infantry, 5 separate assault groups hitting different sectors of Bastogne's perimeter simultaneously. This was the coordinated attack Roberts had feared, the kind that would test whether American defenses could hold when pressed everywhere at once. Combat Command B held the southern sector of Bastogne's perimeter, roughly 40% of the defensive line. All 5 German assault groups hit within CCB's area of responsibility. The fighting was close range and brutal. German infantry reached American positions in several places, forcing hand-to-hand combat in foxholes and buildings. American tanks, positioned in hull-down defensive positions, fired into German infantry at ranges measured in dozens of yards. Artillery support, carefully pre-registered on likely German approach routes, broke up German formations before they could concentrate. By mid-afternoon, the German assault had stalled. By 1700 hours, German forces were withdrawing, leaving their dead and wounded in the snow. The Americans had held, but at a cost. 43 casualties in CCB alone, 2 tanks destroyed, and ammunition stocks again running low. Christmas Day, 1944. The defenders of Bastogne woke to another clear morning and the largest German assault yet. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans had committed their armored reserve, a full panzer regiment, to the attack. The assault hit all around Bastogne's perimeter, but the main effort was against CCB's positions south of town. German tanks, Mark IVs, and Panthers advanced supported by Panzer Grenadiers. This was the kind of combined arms attack the Wehrmacht had perfected, professional and aggressive. American defenses held because they had to. Tank crews fired from prepared positions, using terrain and concealment to offset the German armor's technical advantages. Infantry engaged German tanks with bazookas at close range, risky but effective. Artillery fired constantly, breaking up German formations and forcing them to spread out rather than concentrate. The battle lasted all day, German forces attacking in waves, American forces defending from positions that they had had nearly a week to prepare. By evening Christmas Day, the German assault had failed. The cost: 98 American casualties in CCB, 5 tanks destroyed, but the perimeter intact. The Germans had thrown everything available at Bastogne and had been repulsed. It was a defensive victory, but everyone knew that defensive victories were finite. Eventually, either German attacks would break through or American defenses would erode to ineffectiveness. December 26, 1944, 1600 hours. The sound that changed everything was different from the German artillery that had become background noise over the past week. This was American artillery firing from south of Bastogne, hitting German positions that had been preparing for another assault. Radio reports came through to CCB headquarters. 4th Armored Division had broken through German lines and was approaching Bastogne from the south. The relief force that Patton had promised, that had been fighting its way north for 4 days, had finally reached Bastogne. At 1645 hours, lead tanks of 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion made physical contact with Combat Command B's southern defensive positions. The siege was broken. The corridor 4th Armored had opened was narrow, barely 250 yards wide and under constant German fire. But it was open. Supplies could come in, wounded could be evacuated, reinforcements could arrive. Bastogne was still surrounded on three sides, still under attack, still a battle zone. But it was no longer isolated, no longer cut off, no longer facing the choice between holding indefinitely or being overrun. The 8 days from December 18th, when Combat Command B arrived in Bastogne, until December 26th, when relief arrived, had transformed CCB from a well-trained combat command into something else entirely. They'd held 40% of Bastogne's perimeter against repeated assaults by German forces that outnumbered them 5-1. They'd repulsed 47 separate German attacks, from company-sized probes to regiment-strength assaults. They'd fired 14,000 rounds of 75mm tank ammunition, 2.1 million rounds of small arms ammunition, and had called in countless artillery missions. The cost had been significant: 642 casualties, including 123 killed, 22 tanks destroyed, and the gradual erosion of combat effectiveness that came from continuous operations without relief. At the moment of breakthrough, CCB's effective strength was 570 men and 22 operational tanks, down from 1,000 men and 40 tanks when they'd arrived. They'd been reduced by attrition to roughly half strength, but they'd accomplished their mission. They'd held Bastogne's southern approaches, had prevented German forces from taking the town, had bought the time that Third Army's relief force needed to fight its way north. December the 27th, 1944. The first convoys bringing supplies and reinforcements began moving through 4th Armored's narrow corridor into Bastogne. German artillery constantly shelled the corridor, making the journey dangerous, but vehicles kept moving. Combat Command B finally received the supplies they'd been rationing for a week: ammunition to replenish exhausted stocks, medical supplies to treat the wounded who'd been waiting for evacuation, fuel to top off tanks that had been operating on fumes. More importantly, they received replacement personnel, fresh soldiers, to fill the gaps in units that had been ground down by 8 days of continuous combat. The replacements couldn't restore CCB to full strength immediately. That would take weeks, but they could provide enough manpower to give exhausted soldiers their first real rest since arriving at Bastogne. The relief of Bastogne didn't end the battle. German forces continued attacking, trying to cut 4th Armored's corridor and re-isolate the town. But the strategic situation had changed. Bastogne was no longer a surrounded American position waiting for relief. It was a defended strongpoint with an open supply line, a base from which American forces could launch operations, rather than just defending against German attacks. The defense of Bastogne's southern perimeter by Combat Command B was one small part of a larger battle involving multiple American units. The 101st Airborne Division gets most of the credit in popular memory, and deservedly so. They held 60% of the perimeter and fought with exceptional courage and skill. But military historians analyzing the battle have noted that CCB's role was disproportionately important for two reasons. First, they had arrived first before the 101st, and had begun organizing defenses that shaped how the entire Bastogne position developed. Second, they held the southern sector, the direction from which both German attacks and American relief came. If CCB's sector had broken, German forces would have flooded into Bastogne from the south. The 101st positions would have been flanked, and the entire defense would have collapsed. The fact that CCB held for 8 days, despite facing the most intense German pressure, despite suffering the highest casualties of any unit defending Bastogne, was critical to the battle's outcome. General McAuliffe, commanding the Bastogne defenders, noted in his after-action report that Combat Command B's defense of the southern approaches prevented the enemy from exploiting what appeared to be the most vulnerable sector of our perimeter. Their performance was instrumental in the successful defense. The famous "nuts" reply to the German surrender demand on December 22nd is often told as General McAuliffe's response. What's less well known is that the German demand was delivered to McAuliffe at Combat Command B's command post, that CCB officers were present for the discussion of how to respond, and that the defiant tone reflected not just McAuliffe's attitude, but the attitude of units like CCB that had been fighting for days and had no intention of surrendering. The surrender demand itself revealed German frustration. They had expected to take Bastogne quickly, to seize the road junction and continue their advance west. Instead, they'd been held up for a week by American forces that should have been overwhelmed. The demand for surrender was less about hoping the Americans would actually quit, and more about German commanders trying to understand why this position was proving so difficult to reduce. The answer, from the American perspective, was a combination of good defensive terrain, thorough preparation during the first days of the siege, effective combined arms coordination, and the simple determination not to give ground. Combat Command B embodied all of those factors. They'd used terrain well, had prepared positions thoroughly, had coordinated tanks and infantry effectively, and had refused to consider surrender or withdrawal despite being surrounded and outnumbered. By December 27th, with Bastogne's siege broken and 4th Armored's corridor secured, Combat Command B could finally assess what the 8-day defense had cost. The casualty numbers were stark: 642 men, 64% of initial strength. Tank losses: 22 destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, 55% of initial strength. But beyond the numbers were the less quantifiable costs. Every man in CCB had been fighting continuously for 8 days, had lived with constant artillery fire, had endured cold and hunger and exhaustion that eroded effectiveness even when it didn't show up in casualty statistics. Unit cohesion, that intangible quality that makes a military formation more than just a collection of individuals, had been strained by casualties and the integration of replacements. Skills that had been sharp after Metz needed refreshing after 8 days of defensive combat that was qualitatively different from offensive operations. The combat command that had raced to Bastogne on December 16th was fundamentally different from the one that emerged from the siege on December 27th. They'd been tested in the hardest way possible, had proven themselves capable of exceptional performance, and had paid a price that would take months to fully recover from. The siege of Bastogne was over for them, but the larger battle continued, and they were still part of it whether they were ready or not. December 28, 1944. North of Bastogne, rolling terrain between the town and the German positions that still threatened it. Combat Command B, reinforced and partially rested after the siege was broken, received orders for their first offensive operation since arriving at Bastogne 10 days earlier. The mission was reconnaissance in force, push north from Bastogne, identify German defensive positions, engage enemy armor if encountered. For tank crews who'd spent 8 days in defensive positions, the order to advance was both welcome and concerning. Welcome because it meant they were moving from defense to offense, from reacting to German attacks to initiating their own. Concerning because intelligence reports suggested that German armor in the sector included heavy tanks, possibly Tigers, from 1st SS Panzer Corps, the Tigers that had haunted American tankers' nightmares since training. The 56-ton monsters with 88mm guns and armor that Shermans couldn't penetrate frontally were reportedly in the area. Combat Command B was about to discover whether the tactical innovations they had developed at Metz would work against Germany's most feared weapon. The first contact came at 1000 hours, 3 miles north of Bastogne. Company B, 21st Tank Battalion, Captain James Leach commanding, encountered German armor defending a small ridge. The tanks were hull down, only their turrets visible, but the distinctive boxy shape and long gun barrel were unmistakable. Tiger is, probably 3 of them, with supporting Mark IV tanks. This was the nightmare scenario from training exercises, the situation where doctrine said American armor should withdraw and call for air support or tank destroyers. But Leach had learned at Metz that doctrine was a starting point, not a straitjacket. His company was positioned in a small valley with wooded slopes on either side. The Tigers held the high ground ahead. Direct assault would be suicide. Withdrawal would cede the terrain. Leach's solution was to apply the wedge and hammer tactic that had evolved during the Metz fighting. He'd take 3 Shermans directly toward the Tigers, obviously and aggressively, drawing their attention. Meanwhile, 2 more Shermans and an attached M18 tank destroyer would use the wooded slopes to move onto the Tigers' flank, where their side armor was vulnerable even to American guns. The execution of Leach's plan took 40 minutes of careful maneuvering. His 3 lead Shermans advanced up the valley, moving fast, presenting difficult targets. The Tigers engaged at 1,200 yards, their 88mm guns accurate at that range. The first German shot missed. The second hit one of Leach's Shermans on the frontal armor, penetrating and killing the tank. But the Shermans kept advancing, firing back ineffectively, but creating the impression of a determined frontal assault. The Tigers concentrated on this obvious threat, their commanders confident that their frontal armor was invulnerable to American 75mm guns. They were right about their frontal armor. What they hadn't noticed was the American flanking force moving through the woods. At 10:45, Leach's flanking element reached firing positions 700 yards from the Tigers' flank. The M18 tank destroyer, with its 90mm gun, fired first. The round struck the lead Tiger in the side, penetrating the 70mm side armor and destroying the tank. The 2 Sherman tanks in the flanking force engaged the second Tiger, both firing simultaneously. One round missed, the other struck the turret ring, jamming the turret and immobilizing the tank. The third Tiger, recognizing the threat, began to traverse its turret toward the flanking force. Before it could engage, the tank destroyer fired again, hitting the Tiger in the engine compartment and setting it on the fire. 3 Tigers destroyed in less than 3 minutes. The engagement north of Bastogne was significant not for its tactical impact. 3 destroyed Tigers didn't change the strategic situation, but for what it proved about American armor tactics. The Tigers had every material advantage: better guns, better armor, better optics, better training. But material advantages could be offset by tactical sophistication. The wedge and hammer approach, developed during the Metz fighting and refined through necessity, worked against even the Wehrmacht's best armor when executed properly. Captain Leach's after-action report noted, "The Tigers never saw the flanking force until we were shooting them. Their commanders were focused on the obvious threat and missed the real one. We used German defensive tactics against German offensive equipment and won." The report circulated through Third Army with remarkable speed. By December 30th, other American armored units were incorporating Leach's approach into their own operations. The 10th Armored Division, through combat experience and tactical innovation, had developed a method for defeating Tigers that didn't rely on air support or numerical superiority. They'd figured out how to hunt Germany's apex predators. January 3rd, 1945, Bra, Luxembourg, Combat Command Reserve, which had been defending Echternach throughout the Bulge, encountered their first Tiger IIs, the King Tigers, that represented Germany's ultimate development of heavy tank design. The King Tiger was even more formidable than the Tiger the Fur, 68 tons, an 88mm L71 gun with higher velocity and penetration. Frontal armor, 150mm thick, that was effectively immune to American tank guns at any range. Doctrine said King Tigers should be avoided entirely, engaged only by specialized tank destroyers with the heaviest guns. But Combat Command Reserve's tankers had been talking to Combat Command B's crews, had heard about the wedge and hammer tactics, had absorbed the lesson that Tigers could be killed if you didn't try to fight them on their terms. The engagement at Bras pitted 2 American M18 tank destroyers against 1 King Tiger defending a road junction. The Americans used terrain brilliantly, positioning themselves on a ridge 1,800 yards from the King Tiger, at the extreme effective range of their 90mm guns, but beyond where the King Tiger's commander could identify them clearly. The first American shot missed. The King Tiger began traversing its turret, trying to locate the threat. The second American shot struck the King Tiger's frontal armor and bounced off. The 90mm round insufficient to penetrate that thick plate, but the impact revealed the American position to the German crew. The King Tiger fired, missing the tank destroyers but forcing them to relocate. The duel continued for 20 minutes, the Americans shooting and moving, the King Tiger returning fire, neither side achieving decisive hits. Then, as the King Tiger maneuvered to engage the tank destroyers more effectively, its right track broke, a mechanical failure possibly caused by the stress of rapid maneuvering on frozen ground. The immobilized King Tiger was destroyed by concentrated fire from both American tank destroyers. The engagement report noted, King Tiger destroyed by combination of long-range fire and mechanical failure. Enemy tanks' weight and complexity made it vulnerable to reliability issues that American tanks don't experience. By January 9, 1945, as the 10th Armored Division continued operations to reduce the Bulge salient, they'd accumulated an impressive record against German heavy armor. Official tallies, based on confirmed kills with photographic evidence or physical inspection of destroyed vehicles, credited the division with 27 Tiger and King Tiger destructions since December 16th. This was the highest Tiger kill count of any American division in 3rd Army, achieved in less than a month of combat. The kill methods varied. 18 destroyed by M, 18 Hellcat tank destroyers using their superior mobility and 90mm guns at long range. 6 destroyed by M10 tank destroyers. Older and less mobile than the M18s, but still effective when well positioned. 3 destroyed by Sherman tanks achieving flank or rear shots, always at close range where the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate thinner side armor. The statistics told a story of tactical adaptation. The 10th Armored wasn't winning Tiger fights through superior equipment. They didn't have it. They were winning through superior tactics, using American advantages in mobility and numbers to create situations where German material superiority didn't matter. The exchange ratio against Tigers was particularly revealing. For every American tank lost fighting German heavy armor, the 10th Armored destroyed 3.4 Tigers or King Tigers. This ratio was unprecedented in American armored operations and reflected both tactical sophistication and the specific circumstances of combat in the Bulge. The Germans were attacking, advancing through terrain that gave American forces opportunities to ambush and flank. American tank destroyers, positioned defensively, could choose engagement ranges that favored their guns, and the tactical methods that had evolved from Metz through Bastogne gave American crews proven approaches for engaging heavy armor without trying to fight them frontally. A captured German tanker, interrogated after his King Tiger was destroyed by Combat Command, A, near the Saar, provided insight into how German crews viewed the 10th Armored's tactics. "You fight like SS Panzer divisions," he told his interrogators. "You use terrain, you coordinate supporting arms, you don't attack stupidly. Most American tankers try to fight our Tigers directly and die. Your units fight intelligently and win." The technical details of how Sherman crews learned to kill Tigers revealed the depth of tactical thinking the 10th Armored had developed. Tiger that we have specifications: 56 tons, 88mm K-Bois-Lycée, 36 gun, effective to 2,500 yards, frontal armor 100mm. Vulnerabilities: side armor only 70mm, vulnerable to 75mm fire within 500 yards. Rear armor 60mm, vulnerable at 700 yards. Track width 28.5 inches, causing mobility problems in deep snow or mud. Engine reliability issues after extended operations. American tankers were taught to use these vulnerabilities systematically. Force Tigers to maneuver, stress their mechanical systems, engage from flanks, not frontally. Use terrain to close within effective range before Tigers could engage accurately. Coordinate tank and tank destroyer fires to overwhelm German crews' ability to respond to multiple threats. These weren't revolutionary insights, but they were insights that had to be learned through combat and then systematically taught to replacement crews. The 10th Armored's training pipeline, established during the Siege of Bastogne and continuing through January, incorporated Tiger fighting tactics into standard crew training. New replacements learned not just how to operate their tanks, but specifically how to fight German heavy armor using proven methods. January 12, 1945. The date marked the end of intensive Tiger hunting operations for the 10th Armored Division. The German forces in the Bulge were withdrawing, conserving their remaining heavy armor for the defense of Germany itself. The opportunity to engage Tigers in the relatively favorable conditions of defensive combat was ending. The division's tank battalions compiled final statistics on heavy armor engagements, and the numbers were distributed to other 3rd Army units as lessons learned. Key findings: Tigers could be defeated reliably if American forces refused to fight them on German terms. Frontal engagements at long range favored German guns and armor. Therefore, avoid those engagements. Flanking attacks and ambushes offset German advantages. Therefore, create situations that force Tigers into vulnerable positions. Tank destroyers with 90mm guns were effective against Tigers at ranges where Tiger crews couldn't accurately identify targets. Therefore, use tank destroyers at long range while Shermans maneuvered for flank shots. These lessons, written in the blood of crews who'd learned them through trial and error, became doctrine for American armored forces in the war's final months. The transformation of the 10th Armored Division from a unit that feared Tigers during training to a unit that actively hunted them in combat reflected both institutional learning and individual courage. Tigers were still dangerous, still capable of destroying multiple American tanks before being knocked out. But they were no longer invincible bogeymen. They were enemy weapons with strengths and weaknesses. And the weaknesses could be exploited by crews who understood how. The psychological impact of this transformation was as important as the tactical impact. American tankers who'd entered the war, believing German armor was technically superior, learned that superior equipment could be overcome by superior tactics. That confidence, earned through combat victories, changed how American armor operated. Units that might have avoided Tiger encounters began actively seeking them, confident that proven tactics would allow them to win. The 10th Armored Division's contribution to this shift in American armor confidence was significant. They hadn't invented Tiger fighting tactics. Other units had developed similar approaches, but they'd systematized those tactics, had proven they worked consistently, and had trained replacements to use them effectively. By the time the Bulge fighting ended, the division's reputation as Tiger killers was established, not through propaganda, but through demonstrated performance. They'd faced Germany's best tanks with America's adequate tanks, and had won decisively, proving that in armored warfare, as in so much else, how you fight matters more than what you fight with. December 18, 1944. Saar Bridgehead, Eastern France. Combat Command. A's positions across the Saar River, hard won in early December, were now 3 miles deep and under renewed German pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Miles Standish, commanding CCA, studied intelligence reports suggesting that German forces opposite his positions were being reinforced. The reports were accurate. German LXXE Corps, responsible for the Saar sector, had identified the American bridgehead as a threat that needed to be eliminated before those forces could be transferred north to the Ardennes. CCA's mission, holding a position that had seemed important 2 weeks ago, was now critical for different reasons. Every German soldier committed to attacking the Saar bridgehead was one fewer soldier available for the Ardennes offensive. Standish's combat command wasn't fighting a decisive battle. They were fighting a pinning action, tying down German forces through their very existence. The problem was that pinning actions could be just as deadly as decisive battles, and CCA was about to discover that holding the Saar bridgehead would cost nearly as much as Combat Command B's defense of Bastogne, with none of the historical recognition. The German assault on CCA's positions began December 20th and continued through December 28th. The attacks weren't the massive coordinated assaults that characterized German operations in the Ardennes. Instead, they were methodical reduction efforts, attempts to nibble away at American positions until the bridgehead became untenable. German artillery pounded CCA's positions daily, making movement dangerous and forcing constant repairs to defensive works. German infantry probed for weak points, looking for positions that could be infiltrated or overwhelmed. German armor, mostly Mark IV tanks and assault guns, provided direct fire support, engaging American positions from ranges where they could shoot effectively, while remaining relatively safe from American return fire. Combat Command A's response was to apply everything they'd learned at Metz about static defense. They'd improved their positions continuously, digging deeper, adding overhead cover where possible, creating interlocking fields of fire that made any German advance costly. They'd registered artillery on all likely German approach routes, allowing them to bring fire down quickly when attacks developed. They'd positioned their Shermans in hold-down positions that protected them from German tanks while allowing them to support infantry positions. The result was a stalemate, but a stalemate that favored the Americans because it accomplished their mission, Keep German forces engaged in the Saar sector, where they couldn't reinforce the Ardennes. December 19, 1944. Echternach, Luxembourg. Combat Command Reserve. The 10th Armored's 3rd Major Element arrived to find a situation that was confused and deteriorating. German forces had attacked across the Sauer River, establishing small bridgeheads that threatened to expand into full breakthroughs. The mission CCR received was simple in concept, difficult in execution: contain those bridgeheads, prevent German exploitation, hold the line until reinforcements could arrive. Colonel James Riley, commanding CCR, had fewer forces than either CCA or CCB, roughly 800 men, 30 Sherman tanks, and supporting elements. But he had the advantage of arriving before the German bridgeheads were fully developed. His deployment was methodical. Identify the German bridgeheads through reconnaissance. Position forces to contain them without trying to eliminate them immediately. Establish defensive lines that could absorb German attacks while waiting for reinforcement. By December 21st, CCR had established a defensive perimeter around Echternach that effectively boxed in German forces that had crossed the river. The Germans held the town itself, but couldn't expand beyond it. American forces couldn't retake the town, but could prevent it from becoming a platform for further German advances. The fighting at Echternach developed its own rhythm, different from both Bastogne's siege and the Saar's static defense. German forces in the town would attempt to break out, probing CCR's defensive lines looking for weak points. American forces would respond with carefully calibrated counterattacks, pushing German forces back without committing so heavily that they risked being drawn into the kind of urban warfare that would favor German defenders. Artillery duels raged constantly, German guns firing from positions east of the Sauer, American guns responding from positions west of Echternach. The civilian population, trapped in the town, suffered terribly, caught between German occupation and American efforts to contain it. Combat Command Reserve's casualties mounted steadily, 10 to 20 men per day through late December, the kind of attrition that was sustainable in the short term but would erode combat effectiveness if sustained for weeks. By December 30th, CCR had suffered 287 casualties, roughly 35% of their initial strength, and had destroyed 41 German armored vehicles at a cost of 11 American tanks. The coordination between the 10th Armored Division's 3 scattered combat commands was minimal, not because of poor leadership, but because operational circumstances made coordination nearly impossible. CCA in the Saar, CCB in Bastogne, and CCR at Echternach were fighting 3 separate battles against different German forces with different objectives. Division headquarters in Luxembourg City maintained radio contact with all 3, passed intelligence and status reports, coordinated with 3rd Army for supply and reinforcement. But the combat commands themselves operated independently, making tactical decisions based on their local situations without reference to what their sister commands were experiencing. This wasn't how armored divisions were supposed to work. Doctrine emphasized concentration, mutual support, coordinated operations. The 10th Armored was doing none of those things. They were functioning as 3 separate battle groups that happened to share a common administrative headquarters. The remarkable thing wasn't that this arrangement worked poorly. It did work poorly by doctrinal standards, but that it worked at all. December 31st, 1944. After 15 days of operating as 3 separate entities, the 10th Armored Division's combat commands finally began the process of reunification. Combat Command A was ordered to withdraw from the Saar bridgehead, a decision that came as both relief and frustration to CCA's soldiers. They had held that position for nearly a month, had paid for it with 312 casualties, had tied down German forces throughout the Ardennes offensive. Now they were abandoning it, giving up ground they'd fought for because the strategic situation had changed and the bridgehead was no longer needed. The withdrawal was conducted methodically, CCA's units pulling back across the Saar in good order, destroying bridges behind them, leaving the Germans holding nothing but rubble. By January 2nd, CCA had rejoined the rest of the division near Bastogne. Combat Command Reserve completed its Echternach mission on January 3rd, containing the German bridgeheads long enough for reinforcing units to arrive and take over the position. CCR moved to Bastogne on January 4th, completing the division's reunification. For the first time since December 16th, the 10th Armored Division was together, all three combat commands in the same area, able to coordinate operations rather than the fighting separately. The cost of fighting on three fronts simultaneously was clear when the division compiled its casualty reports for December 16th through December 31st. Combat Command, B. 642 casualties. Combat Command, A. 312 casualties. Combat Command, Reserve, 287 casualties. Division Headquarters and supporting units, 93 casualties. Total, 1,334 casualties. Nearly 13% of the division's authorized strength suffered in 15 days of combat. Tank losses across all three combat commands. 98 Shermans destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, representing more than half the division's tank strength. If the division had been concentrated, fighting a single battle, those losses might have achieved a decisive operational result. Instead, they'd been spread across three battles that were tactically successful, but individually indecisive. CCA had held the Saar bridgehead. CCB had held Bastogne. CCR had contained Echternach. None of those achievements ended the war, or even ended the battle. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, contributing to the overall Allied success in blunting the German offensive, but not individually decisive. The historical recognition of the 10th Armored Division's role in the Battle of the Bulge has been heavily skewed toward Combat Command B's defense of Bastogne. 94% of popular histories of the battle mention Bastogne and usually credit the 101st Airborne Division, occasionally acknowledging CCB's role. Only 6% mention the Saar or Echternach operations. This disparity reflects how military history gets written. Dramatic, concentrated battles like Bastogne's siege make better narratives than dispersed, grinding actions like CCA and CCR fought. But the disparity doesn't reflect military importance. If CCA had failed to hold the Saar bridgehead, German forces from that sector would have reinforced the Ardennes. If CCR had failed to contain Echternach, German forces would have threatened Luxembourg City and Third Army's supply lines. The three battles were interdependent, each necessary to the overall success, even though only one captured historical imagination. The officers and men of combat commands A and Reserve understood their roles' relative obscurity and generally accepted it. After-action interviews conducted in January and February 1945 captured a consistent theme. The soldiers knew what they'd accomplished, knew it had mattered, didn't need external validation. A sergeant from CCA's 21st Tank Battalion put it plainly. CCB got the glory because Bastogne was dramatic. We got frozen and shot at in the Saar for 2 weeks and nobody noticed. But we know what we did. We kept Germans busy who would have been killing our guys elsewhere. That's enough. The attitude reflected professional satisfaction with mission accomplishment, even when that accomplishment didn't come with recognition. Military effectiveness wasn't about glory. It was about achieving objectives. And all three combat commands had done exactly that. January 8th, 1945. The reunited 10th Armored Division, now concentrated near Bastogne and restored to something approximating coordinated operations, received orders for the next phase of operations. Spearhead Third Army's attack to eliminate the Bulge salient entirely. The three combat commands that had fought separately for 2 weeks would now fight together, employing the combined arms coordination and concentrated power that armored doctrine said divisions should employ. The transition from defensive, dispersed operations to offensive, concentrated operations required several days of planning and preparation. Units needed to reorient from defensive mindsets to offensive thinking. Casualties needed to be replaced with personnel from the replacement pipeline. Equipment needed to be repaired or replaced, bringing tank strength back toward authorized levels. Training needed to be conducted, particularly for replacement crews who would join the division during the dispersed operations and hadn't worked with their new units in offensive scenarios. By January 12th, the 10th Armored Division was ready for offensive operations. Diminished in strength from early December, but experienced, confident, and finally able to function as a unified division rather than three separate battle groups. The story of Combat Commands A and Reserve during the Battle of the Bulge is the story of soldiers doing difficult, necessary work without expectation of recognition. They held positions that doctrine said they shouldn't have to hold. They fought battles that strategically minded observers might dismiss as secondary to the main action at Bastogne. They suffered casualties at rates comparable to units in more famous battles, while knowing their contributions would be overshadowed. And they did all of this professionally, effectively, without complaint beyond the normal grousing that characterized any military unit in combat. The 10th Armored Division's ability to fight effectively on three fronts simultaneously wasn't a triumph of doctrine. It violated doctrine comprehensively, but a triumph of training, leadership, and institutional resilience. The division that had spent 2 years preparing for war discovered that war required them to do things they'd never trained for: operate dispersed, fight independently, maintain effectiveness despite being scattered across 100 miles. The fact that they succeeded, that all three combat commands accomplished their missions, validated both their preparation and their ability to adapt when circumstances demanded it. The forgotten flank, the battles that history barely remembers, were as critical to victory as the famous defense they overshadowed. January 13th, 1945. The Bulge salient, Belgium. Snow covered the landscape in a white blanket 3 feet deep in places, and the temperature at dawn registered -8 degrees Fahrenheit. The 10th Armored Division, reunited after 2 weeks of dispersed operations, faced a new mission that was as unglamorous as it was necessary. Reduce the remaining German salient, village by village, eliminating the last German positions west of their original lines. General Patton had described the operation in characteristically blunt terms during the briefing. The breakthrough phase is over. The dramatic stuff is done. Now we have the ugly work of pushing the Germans back through terrain they've had time to prepare. It's going to be slow, it's going to be costly, and it's going to be necessary. The 10th Armored, selected to lead Third Army's main effort, would discover that Patton's assessment was accurate. The fighting ahead would bear no resemblance to the mobile operations they had trained for, or even the siege warfare they'd experienced at Bastogne. This would be grinding attritional combat where progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day and every village cost blood. The Bulge salient, a bulge in the American lines that protruded east toward German positions, contained 34 square miles of fortified villages and forested terrain. German defenders were remnants of divisions that had been shattered during the Ardennes offensive, reorganized into ad hoc battle groups, and ordered to hold every meter of ground. They lacked the strength for offensive operations, but remained dangerous defenders. They'd used the 2 weeks since the German offensive stalled to prepare positions. Trenches dug in frozen ground, buildings reinforced with sandbags and timber, fields of fire cleared through forests, mines planted on likely American approach routes. The German units were a mixture: exhausted Panzer Grenadiers from elite divisions, scattered infantry from Volksgrenadier units, stragglers from various formations, all consolidated under whatever officers could be found. What they lacked in organization and supply, they compensated for with desperation. These men knew they were defending the approaches to Germany itself. Surrender meant prison camps. Fighting meant at least the possibility of survival and withdrawal to defend their homeland. January 16th, 1945. The village of Majoret, population perhaps 200 before the war, now a fortified position defended by approximately 300 German soldiers from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Combat Command. A drew the mission to clear it, and the operation revealed how much the nature of warfare had changed from the mobile operations of summer 1944. The attack began with a 2-hour artillery preparation, American guns systematically destroying buildings that might shelter German troops. Then came the armor, Sherman tanks advancing in the sub-zero cold, their engines barely starting after sitting overnight, their tracks struggling for traction on icy roads. The Germans waited until the Shermans were within 300 yards before opening fire with Panzerfausts. the shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets that had proven devastatingly effective in close terrain. 2 American tanks were knocked out in the first minutes, their crews bailing out into snow and German small arms fire. The advance stalled, American forces pinned down by German fire from positions that artillery hadn't eliminated. The battle for Madurai lasted 9 hours, finally ending when American infantry infiltrated through buildings on the village's flank and cleared German positions house by house. American casualties: 43 men. Ground gained: 1 village, half a mile of advance. It was January 16th. At this rate, clearing the Borsy salient would take weeks. The pattern established at Madurai repeated across the salient through mid-January. Each village required similar operations: artillery preparation, armored advance, inevitable German resistance from positions that couldn't be destroyed by indirect fire, infantry assault to clear remaining defenders, consolidation before moving to the next objective. The weather made everything harder. Temperatures that rarely rose above freezing during the day and plunged to -15 at night created conditions where men and machines barely functioned. Soldiers developed frostbite from exposure during extended operations. Tank engines froze if not run periodically. Weapons malfunctioned, their mechanisms seizing in the cold. Ammunition behaved unpredictably, propellant affected by extreme temperatures. Wounded men died from exposure before they could be evacuated. The winter of 1944 to 45 was one of the coldest in 50 years, and the soldiers fighting through it endured conditions that resembled the Eastern Front more than the Western European campaign they had expected. January 20th, 1945, Troyes, Belgium, a crossroads village that intelligence identified as a German strongpoint. Combat Command, Aussicht B, rotated into the attack after CCA had been fighting for 5 days, approached Troyes expecting another grinding village fight. What they encountered was different. German Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, elite infantry, who'd been fighting since the offensive's opening and had no intention of yielding ground easily. The battle for Troyes became house-to-house fighting at its most brutal. American infantry from the 54th Armored Infantry Battalion would clear a building only to have German troops infiltrate back in through cellars and connecting basements that honeycombed the village. Tank support was limited. The streets were too narrow for Shermans to maneuver effectively, and German Panzerfaust teams could stalk them in the confined spaces. The fighting devolved into small unit actions. Squads and platoons clearing rooms with grenades and small arms. No artillery support, because the ranges were measured in yards and American and German positions were intermingled. Company A of the 54th spent 7 hours fighting through Troyes, suffering 68 casualties, including 14 killed, before the village was secured. The German defenders lost an estimated 120 men, but had delayed the American advance by a full day. For defenders without hope of reinforcement or supply, trading casualties at better than 2 to 1 in exchange for delay was a victory. The advance rate through the Borsy salient averaged 0.4 of a mile per day, roughly 400 yards. This glacial pace was a function of terrain, weather, and German defensive skill. In summer offensives across France, American armored divisions had advanced 3 to 5 miles per day against similar German resistance. The difference was environmental. Summer terrain allowed maneuver, flanking movements, exploitation of breakthrough. Winter terrain channeled attacks along roads, the only surfaces where vehicles could move. German defenders positioned themselves to cover those roads, knowing Americans had to come that way. The forests, which in summer would have provided cover for infiltration, were now obstacles, their snow-filled understory impassable to vehicles and nearly impassable to infantry. The result was warfare that resembled World War I, more than the mobile operations of World War II. Grinding, linear advances against prepared positions, success measured in yards rather than miles, casualties mounting without corresponding operational gains. Frostbite casualties rivaled combat casualties during the Borsy operations. The 10th Armored Division's Medical Battalion reported 187 frostbite cases, severe enough to require evacuation, between January 13th and January 25th. This compared to 203 combat casualties during the same period, nearly equal numbers. Frostbite was classified as a preventable casualty, theoretically avoidable through proper clothing and rotation schedules. But theory met reality in the Borsy salient. Soldiers couldn't rotate out of combat when operations were continuous. Winter clothing was inadequate for temperatures that dropped below zero. Replacements arriving from rear areas often lacked proper cold weather gear. Even when clothing was adequate, extended operations in sub-zero conditions guaranteed exposure injuries. Feet went numb in wet boots. Hands became clumsy in gloves that were warm enough to prevent frostbite but too thick to allow fine motor control needed for operating weapons. Faces developed frostbite despite balaclavas and scarves. The cold was an enemy as dangerous as the Germans, and it took casualties continuously regardless of tactical situation. January 25th, 1945, Wampach, Belgium. The final German defensive line in the Borsy salient, a prepared position along a ridgeline that offered excellent observation and fields of fire. Combat Command Reserve, which had been held in reserve during the early stages of the operation, received the mission to break this position. The attack, planned as a coordinated assault by all three combat commands acting together for the first time since the division's reunification, would test whether the 10th Armored had retained its effectiveness after 6 weeks of continuous combat. The assault began at 0600 hours with the heaviest artillery preparation the division had fired since Metz. 180 guns, division artillery, plus attached corps artillery battalions, pounded German positions for 90 minutes. Then came the armor, all three combat commands attacking abreast across a 5-mile front. The Germans, weakened by casualties and supply shortages, couldn't hold against concentrated assault. By 1400 hours, the ridge was in American hands. By evening, German forces were withdrawing east in disorder. The Borsy salient was eliminated. The battle that had consumed 2 weeks and cost over 400 American casualties was finished. January 28, 1945. The 10th Armored Division was withdrawn from combat for the first time since early November. They'd been in continuous operations for 74 consecutive days, longer than any other American armored division in the European theater. The wear showed in every measurable statistic. Personnel strength, 8,100 men, 78% of authorized strength. The remainder gap filled by casualties not yet replaced. Tank strength, 143 operational Shermans of 186 authorized, the deficit representing destroyed vehicles not yet replaced by new production. Vehicle maintenance, 63% of trucks and half-tracks required significant repair work, wear and tear from continuous operations. Morale, surprisingly high according to unit chaplains and medical officers, though exhaustion was universal. The division that had entered the Bulge in December as one of Third Army's best equipped and trained units emerged in late January as a veteran formation that had been ground down by attrition and needed significant reconstitution before it could return to operations. The ammunition expenditure during the Borsy operations revealed the intensity of the fighting. The division fired 127 tons of ammunition per day, compared to 45 tons per day during the Metz operations. The increase reflected both the difficulty of the fighting and the American approach to combat. When in doubt, use firepower. Artillery shells, tank rounds, small arms ammunition, all were expended in quantities that would have been unimaginable to armies earlier in the war. The logistical effort required to deliver this ammunition to forward units over icy roads and through winter weather was itself a remarkable achievement. Supply convoys ran continuously, trucks moving forward with ammunition and returning with wounded. Fuel consumption was similarly intensive, vehicles burning gasoline just to keep engines warm in sub-zero temperatures. The American logistical system, often taken for granted, was what made sustained winter operations possible. German forces in the Bulge had comparable tactical skill, but lacked the logistics to sustain operations. American forces had the logistics to keep fighting, regardless of conditions. The villages liberated during the Borsy operations were devastated, some damaged beyond recognition. 23 villages cleared by the 10th Armored, all showing extensive battle damage. Civilian casualties were significant, though exact numbers were never compiled. Belgian civilians caught between German defenders and American attackers suffered from artillery fire, small arms exchanges, and the general destruction that accompanied intensive combat in built-up areas. Post-combat civilian interviews revealed the nightmare of being trapped in a combat zone, families sheltering in cellars while fighting raged overhead, houses destroyed by artillery, villages changing hands multiple times with each change bringing new dangers. The American soldiers who liberated these villages found grateful civilians, but also devastated communities that would require years to rebuild. The cost of liberation wasn't borne solely by the soldiers who did the fighting. Civilians in the combat zone paid their own price, and that price was rarely calculated in official histories. The prisoner count from the Bulge operations reflected the German army's deteriorating situation. The 10th Armored Division captured 2,147 German soldiers, compared to 482 German killed. This 4-to-1 ratio of prisoners to killed was much higher than earlier in the war, when German soldiers had fought more aggressively and surrendered less frequently. By January 1945, German soldiers increasingly understood that the war was lost and that survival meant surrender. Not all German units surrendered easily. The Fallschirmjäger at Troyes fought to virtual annihilation, but most German soldiers, when flanked or surrounded, chose to surrender rather than fight to the death. This shift in German behavior made American operations somewhat less costly than they might have been. Villages that could have been defended fanatically were instead yielded once German defenders realized their position was untenable. The Wehrmacht was still dangerous, still capable of inflicting casualties, but it was no longer the confident, aggressive force that had launched the Ardennes offensive 6 weeks earlier. The extraction of the 10th Armored Division from combat on January 28 came as relief mixed with pride. Relief because the grinding combat of the Bulge operations had pushed men and equipment to their limits. Pride because they had accomplished everything asked of them, had held critical positions during the Bulge's defensive phase, had led the attack during the counteroffensive, had cleared German positions that other divisions might have struggled with. The statistics from their 74 consecutive days of combat told a story of sustained effectiveness under brutal conditions. 183 combat days since entering combat in early November, 4,228 total casualties, representing 41% of the division's authorized strength, 276 enemy tanks destroyed, 15,000 estimated enemy casualties inflicted, 38,000 enemy soldiers captured. These were numbers that reflected both achievement and cost. The 10th Armored Division had performed as Patton had needed them to perform, had been his trusted instrument throughout the campaign's most critical phase. The cost of that trust, measured in destroyed equipment and dead soldiers, was something the division would carry forward into whatever operations came next. But first, they needed rest, reconstitution, and time to absorb the lessons from 2.5 months of combat that had transformed them from a well-trained division into hardened veterans who'd earned their place among the war's elite formations. January 29, 1945, Thionville, France. The field hospital, where the 10th Armored Division's wounded had been evacuated during the Bulge operations. Major Sarah Collins, division surgeon, compiled casualty statistics that would form the basis of the official after-action medical report. The numbers were stark and grew worse as she worked through the data. December the 16th through January 28, 44 days of Bulge-related operations, 2,842 total casualties. The breakdown revealed the battle's intensity. 432 killed in action, 1,543 wounded requiring evacuation, 867 missing or captured. The killed in action number particularly troubled Collins. 432 dead soldiers, each representing a family that would receive a telegram, a life that ended in frozen Belgian fields or small village streets. She'd treated many of these men in the hours before they died, had seen the kinds of wounds that modern warfare inflicted, had learned to recognize when medical intervention would save a life and when it would merely prolong death. The missing and captured number was almost as painful. 867 soldiers whose fates were unknown, some probably dead, others prisoners in German camps, all lost to their units and families. The casualty distribution across the division revealed which units had borne the heaviest burden. Combat Command B, which had held Bastogne and then fought in the counteroffensive, 1,289 casualties, representing 48% casualty rate compared to their strength when they'd arrived at Bastogne. Combat Command A, which had defended the Sarre bridgehead and then participated in clearing the Bourcy salient, 634 casualties, 37% rate. Combat Command Reserve, which had contained Echternach and fought in the counteroffensive, 593 casualties, 41% rate. Division headquarters and supporting units, which had remained relatively out of direct combat, 326 casualties, reflecting the fact that even rear area units took casualties from German artillery and air attack. The differential casualty rates revealed what military historians already knew. Units in direct, sustained combat suffered much higher losses than those in supporting roles, and units tasked with the most difficult missions, like CCB's defense of Bastogne, paid the highest price. February 2nd, 1945. The replacement depot at Ardennes, Belgium, where 3,147 soldiers had been assembled for assignment to the 10th Armored Division. These replacements, most of them fresh from training in the United States with minimal combat experience, would fill the gaps left by casualties. The replacement process was both necessary and problematic. Necessary because a division at 60% strength couldn't function effectively, couldn't take on new missions without being reconstituted to something approaching full strength. Problematic because replacements lacked the experience and cohesion that made veteran units effective. They didn't know the informal procedures that governed how units actually operated. They hadn't been through combat with the men they'd be fighting alongside. They represented fresh manpower, but not immediate combat effectiveness. Division training officers estimated it would take 2 to 3 weeks of intensive training before replacement personnel would be properly integrated into their units. Until then, the 10th Armored Division existed in a strange limbo, nominally restored to strength on paper, actually diminished in effectiveness until the replacements were properly absorbed. February 5th, 1945. The division memorial service, held in a field near Thionville with as many division personnel as could be assembled without compromising security. The division chaplain, Captain Robert Morrison, conducted the service for 432 men killed during the Bulge operations. Their bodies had been buried in temporary military cemeteries scattered across Belgium and Luxembourg, to be moved later to permanent cemeteries or repatriated to the United States based on family wishes. But the memorial service wasn't about bodies. It was about acknowledging loss, about giving survivors a moment to mourn comrades who wouldn't be going home. Morrison's remarks were brief and carefully chosen. He spoke about sacrifice, about duty, about the knowledge that their deaths had served a purpose. He read the names, all 432 names, a litany that took 40 minutes. He offered prayer for the survivors, for the wounded recovering in hospitals, for the families who would receive news of their losses. The service was military in its formality, but human in its emotion. Men who'd fought together and lost friends stood in winter cold and remembered. The ceremony wouldn't bring anyone back. It wouldn't ease the pain of loss, but it marked the loss, acknowledged it officially, gave survivors permission to mourn before returning to the business of being soldiers. The letters home, written by survivors in early February, revealed the psychological cost of the Bulge operations. Letters intercepted by censors, read to ensure no classified information was being disclosed, showed patterns that concerned division leadership. Soldiers described exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. They wrote about survivors' guilt, wondering why they had lived when friends had died. They expressed doubt about whether they could endure more combat. Some letters bordered on depression, describing a numbness that had replaced earlier enthusiasm. Division psychiatrists reviewing censor reports identified 89 soldiers who showed signs of what was then called combat exhaustion, and later would be recognized as post-traumatic stress. These men were quietly transferred to rear area duties, given time to recover without the stigma of psychiatric evacuation. But the letters also showed resilience. Most soldiers, even those expressing grief and exhaustion, concluded their letters with determination to see the war through. They'd lost friends, but remained committed to the mission. They were tired, but not broken. The psychological damage was real, but not disabling for most. The minority who couldn't continue were evacuated. The majority absorbed their trauma and prepared to return to combat. February 8th, 1945. Division Personnel Office compiled statistics on officer casualties that revealed a troubling pattern. 186 officers had become casualties during the Bulge operations, representing 74% of the division's original officer corps. The distribution was particularly concerning for company-grade officers. 93 of 128 company commanders, platoon leaders, and executive officers had been killed, wounded, or captured. This represented a catastrophic loss of leadership at the level where battles were actually fought. Company commanders who knew their soldiers, who'd trained with them and led them at Metz, were gone. Platoon leaders who understood small unit tactics and maintained cohesion under stress were mostly casualties. The replacements arriving to fill these positions were technically qualified. The Army didn't commission incompetent officers, but they lacked the experience and unit knowledge that made combat leaders effective. Rebuilding the officer corps would take months, and the division would enter future operations led substantially by officers who hadn't been through the crucible of Metz and the Bulge. Tank losses during the Bulge operations provided insight into the intensity of armored combat. 98 Sherman tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, plus 47 more damaged but repairable, meant the division had lost, or temporarily lost, 145 of its 186 authorized tanks, 78% of tank strength. The destroyed tanks represented not just equipment, but dead and wounded crew members, 5 men per tank, who'd been killed or injured when their vehicles were hit. The replacement tanks, arriving from depots in France, were mechanically identical to those destroyed, but lacked the modifications that veteran crews had made to their vehicles: additional armor welded to vulnerable points, improved vision devices, personal equipment storage. Each replacement tank needed to be brought up to unit standards through the same modifications process, work that tank crews did themselves when time and materials were available. The process of absorbing 145 replacement tanks while simultaneously training replacement crews was a significant undertaking that would occupy much of February. The comparison to other American divisions in the Bulge provided context for the 10th Armored's casualties. The 106th Infantry Division, which had been overrun in the offensive's opening days, suffered 91% casualties, including 2 entire regiments captured. The 10th Armored's 27% casualty rate was severe, but not catastrophic. The 2nd Armored Division, fighting in the northern shoulder of the Bulge, suffered 23% casualties in similar time frame, slightly less than the 10th Armored, but comparable. The 4th Armored Division, which had driven the relief corridor to Bastogne, suffered 18% casualties, substantially less, reflecting their shorter time in intensive combat. These comparisons weren't meant to minimize anyone's losses, but to provide perspective. The 10th Armored's casualties were in line with other divisions that had fought major Bulge battles. They'd paid a high price, but not an unprecedented one. Other units had suffered as much or more. The cost of victory in winter warfare against a desperate enemy was measured in casualties that seemed appalling, but were, tragically, normal for the circumstances. Purple Heart medals awarded during this period. 1,876, representing every soldier wounded or killed in action. The medal, established by George Washington and revived in World War II, symbolized wounds received in combat, but also represented something less tangible: membership in a community of those who had paid blood for their service. Men who received Purple Hearts wore them not as decorations, but as identifiers, visible markers that they'd been in combat and paid a personal price. For the 10th Armored Division, the extraordinary number of Purple Hearts represented both the cost of their operations and the intensity of combat they had experienced. Nearly 1 in 5 soldiers in the division had been wounded or killed. Units with that level of casualties were transformed from their original composition. The 10th Armored Division of February 1945 was substantially different from the division that had entered the Bulge in December, not in organization or equipment, but in the people who filled its ranks. February 12, 1945. General Newgarden received the final statistical compilation from his personnel section and spent the evening reviewing what the Bulge had cost his division. The numbers told a clear story. The division had entered the battle as one of Third Army's most experienced and capable formations. It emerged as a veteran unit that had proven itself repeatedly, but had paid for that proof with losses that would take months to fully replace. Combat effectiveness, that intangible quality that made some divisions more effective than others, had been maintained, but at significant cost. The division could still fight, could still accomplish missions, but it was no longer the fresh, thoroughly trained formation it had been. It was now a veteran unit with all that implied: experienced but worn down, tactically sophisticated but depleted, confident but tired. Newgarden's assessment, written in his personal journal that evening, captured the complexity. We did what Patton asked, held 3 critical positions, fought in the counter-offensive, cleared the Bulge, cost us over 2,800 casualties, nearly half our tanks, most of our original officers. Worth it? Strategically, yes. The Bulge was stopped partly because we held when others might have broken. Personally, for the men who died or were maimed, that's not my calculation to make. They did their duty. That's all soldiers can do. The long-term impact of Bulge casualties on the division would extend far beyond February 1945. Veterans of the Bulge would form the core of the division for the rest of the war, their experience shaping how the unit fought in subsequent operations. But the psychological scars,